After a decade of carrying my family from the brink of financial ruin, my father handed our entire legacy over to my sister, a woman who had only been back in the country for exactly 7 days. I calmly set down the power of attorney and my set of the estate keys. "Congratulations, Lina," I told her. My mother simply nodded, adding that my sister deserved it. But when my sister tore open the wax-sealed envelope I left on the table, she completely exploded, screaming that I had to be joking. Before I share exactly what was in that letter, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against a family that only valued you for what you could provide. The heavy mahogany dining table in my parents' historic Atlanta estate was supposed to be a place of gathering. Tonight, it was a battleground. I am Aaliyah Caldwell, 32 years old, and a corporate turnaround consultant. For the last 10 years, I have been the invisible spine of the Caldwell family. I fixed the messes, paid the secret debts, and smiled for the cameras at the charity galas. But tonight, all of that came to a grinding halt. We were halfway through the main course when my father Bozeman cleared his throat. He did not ask for my attention. He demanded it. Without a single word of warning, he tossed a thick, cream-colored legal folder across the table. It landed directly on top of my dinner plate, the heavy paper soaking up the gravy from my meal. I looked down at the embossed letters of our family lawyer, then up at my father's stern, unyielding face. "I have made some decisions about the future of Caldwell Logistics." My father announced, his voice carrying that familiar patriarchal boom he perfected back when he was a local union representative. "The company needs fresh energy, a modern face to take us into the next decade. As of tomorrow morning, I am stepping down as CEO. Your sister Melina will be taking over the logistics firm, and your mother and I are signing the deed to this estate over to her as an early wedding gift." The dining room fell dead silent. I slowly picked up my napkin and wiped my mouth, my eyes shifting to my younger sister. Melina sat across from me, sipping her wine with a practiced look of humble surprise. She had been living in London for the last 6 years, chasing a European high society lifestyle on a budget she did not actually possess. She had returned home exactly 1 week ago, bringing nothing but designer luggage and her new fiancé, Garrett Thorne. Garrett sat beside her, a 31-year-old East Coast legacy hire who looked entirely out of place in our home. His pale skin and perfectly tailored suit screamed old money, and the patronizing smile he wore made my blood boil. "You are giving the company and the house to Lina," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. "A woman who just learned the address to the corporate office yesterday." My mother Coretta immediately jumped to Melina's defense, her perfectly manicured hands fluttering in the air. "Do not start this, Aaliyah. Your sister has a vision. She is marrying into the Thorne family. Do you understand what Garrett's family name does for us in the business community? This merger is going to elevate our family to a tier we could never reach on our own." I looked around the room, taking in the sheer audacity of the people sitting at that table. This was not just a passing of the torch. This was an active, deliberate erasure of everything I had done. I leaned forward, locking eyes with my father. "A vision, Dad. Is that what we are calling it now? Because my vision recalls a very different reality. 10 years ago, when the freight contracts dried up and the IRS threatened to seize this exact house for tax evasion, Melina did not answer your phone calls. She was busy yacht hopping in the south of France." "Aaliyah, that is enough," my father barked, his fragile ego bruising exactly as I knew it would. "No, I am not finished." I continued, my voice steady, refusing to raise my volume to match his. "I gave up my 20s to keep your name out of the bankruptcy courts. When the supply chain collapsed and you could not meet payroll, it was my signature that secured the bridge loans, not yours. I was the one fielding calls from angry vendors while you were busy playing golf at the country club, pretending everything was fine. I personally paid the mortgage on this dining room while I was still in graduate school. I bled for this family, while Lina ignored your existence until she needed a new credit card." Melina scoffed, examining her diamond engagement ring. "You are just bitter, Aaliyah. You have always been jealous that I actually have a life outside of spreadsheets. Garrett comes from real capital and his family is ready to invest in Caldwell Logistics. You should be thanking us for saving the sinking ship you could not fix. Garrett chuckled, wrapping an arm around Melina's chair. Now, Aaliyah, there is no need for hostility. We all appreciate your hard work keeping the lights on, but macroeconomics requires a certain pedigree. We will make sure you get a nice severance package. My mother nodded enthusiastically, completely blind to the condescension dripping from her future son-in-law's mouth. Melina represents our family's future legacy now, Aaliyah. She deserves it. You are single, you have no family obligations, you can find another place to live. You have your little consulting firm. You will be fine. The sheer disrespect hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg for my rightful place to remind them of my loyalty. But I was done carrying the weight of a family that only viewed me as a utility. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my set of the estate keys. I placed them gently on the mahogany table, right next to the soiled legal folder containing the power of attorney they expected me to blindly sign. I slid both items across the wood until they stopped directly in front of Melina. "Congratulations, Lina," I said softly. My father looked relieved, clearly thinking I had submitted to his authority. My mother sighed, taking a sip of her champagne, celebrating her perceived victory. But I was not finished. From my inside pocket, I withdrew a thick envelope sealed with red wax. It bore the insignia of my own private consulting firm. I placed it directly on top of the keys. "Consider this my wedding gift," I told my sister. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer, and pushed my chair back. "Have a wonderful dinner, everyone." I turned my back on them and walked toward the grand foyer. My heels clicked against the hardwood floors, the sound echoing through the house I had fought so hard to save. I was halfway out the front door when I heard the sharp sound of tearing paper from the dining room. There was a moment of silence followed by a sudden violent crash as a chair was pushed back forcefully. "You are joking!" Melina's voice shrieked, the pristine European facade completely shattering. The pitch of her scream echoed through the halls, laced with absolute panic. "Mom, tell me she is joking." I pulled the heavy front door open and stepped out into the cool evening rain. I did not look back. I did not need to. As I walked to my car, a genuine smile spread across my face. The storm had finally broken, and they had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. The morning after the dinner, the air in my downtown crisis consulting firm felt unusually sharp. I walked off the elevator into the sleek, glass-walled lobby of my company. My heels clicked against the polished concrete, a rhythmic sound that usually grounded me. I had built this firm from the ground up, turning failing companies into profitable powerhouses. I was good at fixing disasters, but the disaster waiting for me this morning was one I had unwittingly funded for a decade. My vice president, Zoe, was waiting at the door of my corner office before I even had a chance to put my bag down. Zoe was brilliant, fiercely loyal, and held a master's degree in forensic accounting. She did not panic easily, which made the tight, controlled expression on her face immediately alarming. "We have a massive problem," Zoe said, following me into my office and shutting the door behind us. "I just got an automated alert from Continental Trust. The joint operational accounts tied to Caldwell Logistics have been locked, every single one of them." I stopped halfway to my desk. "Frozen." "Completely frozen," Zoe confirmed, pulling up the financial data on her tablet and setting it in front of me. "Someone executed an emergency corporate restructuring hold at 6 o'clock this morning. We cannot move a single dollar. Not payroll, not vendor payouts, not the emergency maintenance fund. We are entirely locked out of the logistics accounts." A bitter laugh escaped my throat as I sank into my leather chair. My father was acting fast. His fragile ego had taken a massive hit last night when I walked out of that dining room, and this was his immediate retaliation. Bozeman Caldwell could not stand being challenged, especially by his own daughter. In his mind, freezing the accounts was a flex of his patriarchal authority, a way to remind me who was boss before he handed the keys over to my sister. "He is trying to force my hand," I said, staring at the red access denied banners flashing across the banking portal on Zoe's tablet. "He thinks cutting off my access to the operational funds will make me come crawling back to the estate to apologize. He actually believes he has the leverage. Zoe crossed her arms, her dark eyes flashing with frustration. Aaliyah, you just bailed them out of a $250,000 payroll deficit last month. You have spent the better part of your 30s quietly funneling your own profits into that logistics company just to keep their trucks on the road. Why do you keep letting your parents treat your firm like a free piggy bank while they treat you like the hired help? I leaned back and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline. It was a question I had asked myself 1,000 times, and the answer was always buried deep in generational guilt. In my family, loyalty is not a request, Zoe. I explained, my voice steady, despite the anger simmering just beneath the surface. It is an absolute mandate. My grandfather, Elijah, built Caldwell Logistics from a single delivery truck during the segregation era. He fought tooth and nail to secure a place for a black-owned business in this city. My father inherited that legacy, but he did not inherit my grandfather's business acumen. If Caldwell Logistics fails, it does not just ruin my father's pride, it destroys my grandfather's name. Our family becomes a cautionary tale in the community, and my mother loses her pristine social standing. Zoe shook her head in disbelief. So they groomed you to be the invisible savior while your sister gets to play the princess. Exactly, I said. I was conditioned to be the scapegoat and the shield. Whenever a crisis hit, I was expected to quietly fix it. I spent my college nights balancing their ledgers and negotiating with creditors, so my mother could keep hosting her charity luncheons, and Lina could keep posting vacation photos from Europe. They molded Lina for high society and groomed me for heavy lifting. But I am done lifting. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the direct line to the executive branch manager at Continental Trust. My father thought he was playing chess, but he did not realize I owned the board. As the primary secured creditor who had personally underwritten the logistics company's debt, I had the legal authority to override any standard freeze he tried to implement. Mr. Sterling, I said the moment the bank manager answered, I am looking at a freeze on the Caldwell Logistics joint operational accounts. I need that hold lifted immediately. I am the primary guarantor on those lines of credit. There was a long, uncomfortable pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the rustle of papers, the sound of a man trying to figure out how to deliver bad news. Miss Caldwell, the manager, began, his voice tight with nervous energy. I am afraid I cannot override this hold. This was not a standard internal request from your father. My brow furrowed. I sat up straighter, gesturing for Zoe to come closer and listen. What do you mean it was not a standard request? My father is the CEO on paper. If he did not initiate the freeze, who did? Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. The freeze order did not come from Caldwell Logistics at all, Miss Caldwell. It came from an external wealth management directive. It was authorized by a firm claiming primary executor status over the upcoming corporate merger. My blood ran cold. The merger, the one my father had blindly agreed to with Melina's new fiancé. What firm, Mr. Sterling? I demanded, my tone shifting from professional inquiry to absolute executive command. Give me the name of the firm that just locked my accounts. It was executed by Thorn Capital, the manager admitted quietly. The wealth management firm owned by Garrett Thorn. The line went dead quiet as the reality of those words slammed into me. My father had not frozen me out to teach me a lesson. He had already handed the keys to the kingdom over to a man he met a week ago. Garrett Thorn, a white East Coast legacy hire with a patronizing smile, had just taken full control of my grandfather's legacy, and he was using it to lock me out of my own money. Zoe stared at me as the name Garrett Thorn hung in the air between us. I did not waste time screaming or throwing things across my pristine office. Panic is a luxury I could never afford. Instead, I reached across my glass desk, punched in my mother's private cell number, and hit the speaker button. The ringing echoed in the quiet room. Zoe crossed her arms, tightly pacing behind my chair as we waited. I knew my father was the one who handed over the power, but my mother was the architect of the family's social ambitions. If Garrett was pulling strings at the bank, Coretta Caldwell was the one who gave him the scissors. Aaliyah. I am in the middle of a cake tasting with the wedding planner, my mother answered. Her voice was perfectly modulated, carrying that manufactured, breathless affectation she always adopted whenever she felt particularly wealthy. If you are calling to apologize for your little tantrum at dinner last night, you can call your father directly. I simply do not have the bandwidth for your negativity today. I am not calling to apologize, Mom, I said, leaning forward so my voice would carry clearly through the speaker. I am calling about Garrett Thorne. Care to explain why your future son-in-law just authorized a total freeze on the operational accounts for Caldwell Logistics? Accounts that are legally tied to my consulting firm as the primary guarantor. Why does a man who has been in our lives for exactly 1 week have executor status over grandfather Elijah's company? My mother let out a long, dramatic sigh, the kind meant to make me feel like a difficult child asking a stupid question. Oh, please lower your voice, Aaliyah. You are always so dramatic about business matters. It is standard procedure. Garrett's wealth management team is simply conducting a preliminary audit. The Thorne family requires a clean, unencumbered portfolio before they officially announce the wedding in the high society papers. They cannot have their legacy associated with messy local debts or whatever tangled accounting you have been running down there for the past decade. They need a pristine slate. Tangled accounting. I repeated, letting the absolute absurdity of her words sink in. Mom, that tangled accounting is the only reason you still have a country club membership. That tangled accounting kept Dad out of federal prison when he forgot to pay the commercial property taxes for 3 years in a row. Zoe stopped pacing and glared at the phone. I held up a hand to keep her quiet. I needed my mother to hear every single word I was about to say. You want a clean portfolio for the society papers? I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. Is that what we are calling it now? Because I find it fascinating that you are suddenly so incredibly concerned about financial hygiene. You were not this concerned about optics 2 years ago, when Melina was facing wire fraud charges in Paris. The line went dead quiet for a split second. I have no idea what you are talking about, Coretta said, her tone instantly becoming defensive and sharp. You are being hysterical again. Do not gaslight me, Mom. Not today. I fired back, the years of suppressed resentment finally boiling over. Do you remember my graduation from Wharton? You skipped it. You left me sitting alone in a folding chair receiving my master's degree so you could fly first class to Paris for Melina's luxury fashion launch. A fashion launch that turned out to be a massive illegal scam. She took deposits from high-end European boutiques for inventory that never actually existed. She spent the money on champagne and luxury hotels. Do you remember who she called when the French authorities threatened to seize her passport? Because she certainly did not call Dad. He did not have the cash. I took a deep breath, refusing to let my voice shake. I wired $100,000 of my own consulting fees to a French magistrate to keep your perfect golden child out of a Parisian jail cell. I paid restitution to those boutiques to bury the charges. I bought her freedom and her clean record while you were busy taking photos by the Eiffel Tower, pretending your daughter was a fashion mogul. I never asked for a thank you. I never asked to be paid back. But I will not let you sit there and tell me that my financial management is messy while Garrett Thorne cleans up our name. You are always doing this, my mother snapped, dropping the high society act completely. Her voice was harsh, dripping with venom. You are always trying to tear your sister down. You bring up ancient history just to make yourself look like the martyr. You are just bitter, Aaliyah. You have always been jealous of your sister's beauty and her charm. Melina is marrying into a legacy family. She is securing our future in a way your little spreadsheets and late nights never could. Garrett is stepping in to relieve you of a burden you have always complained about. You should be grateful he is taking over. Step aside gracefully for once in your life and let your sister shine. Do not ruin this wedding just because you are 32 and alone. The cruelty in her words was designed to break me, to put me back in my designated place as the family workhorse who should be grateful for the crumbs of their attention. But the old Aaliyah, the daughter who would swallow her pride and fix the problem, was gone. She died at the dinner table last night. I am not stepping aside, Mom, I said, staring at the flashing red alerts on Zoe's tablet. I am stepping up. Grandfather Elijah built this company with calluses on his hands, and I am not letting a bankrupt East Coast trust fund kid liquidate it for a wedding announcement. You will do what is best for this family, Aaliyah. You will cooperate with Garrett, or you will find yourself completely cut off, Coretta threatened. And with a sharp, echoing click, she hung up the phone. The silence in my office was deafening. The dial tone hummed endlessly until I reached over and pressed the button to end the call. Zoe looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound respect. She had known my family was difficult, but hearing the blatant manipulation firsthand was a different reality. Before either of us could say another word to break the tension, a sharp buzzing sound cut through the quiet room. My personal cell phone was vibrating across the glass surface of my desk. I looked down. The screen lit up with a new text message. It was not a notification from the bank or an alert from a client. It was a direct message from Garrett Thorne. The screen of my phone illuminated the dimming light of my corner office. The message was from an unknown number, but the arrogant, perfectly punctuated tone could only belong to one person. Garrett Thorne, the text read, "Do not make this ugly, Aaliyah. Step aside gracefully, or I will personally ensure your corporate clients find out you are currently under investigation for the severe mismanagement of Caldwell family funds. Do the smart thing and let your sister take the reins." I stared at the glowing text, the audacity of his words burning through the screen. He was not just threatening my position within a family business he had zero right to control. He was actively threatening to destroy the independent crisis consulting firm I had spent my entire adult life building. Mismanagement of funds. Zoe stood on the opposite side of my glass desk, watching my expression shift from quiet anger to a calculating absolute coldness. I handed the phone across the desk. She read the message, her eyes widening as she practically dropped the device back onto the glass. "He is threatening to leak a fake investigation to our biggest clients," Zoe whispered, her voice tight with rising panic. "Aaliyah, if he does that, we lose our corporate contracts within 24 hours. Reputation is everything in crisis management. If our clients think you are embezzling from your own family, we are ruined." I stood up and walked over to the digital whiteboard on my wall, tapping the sleek screen to wake it up. "He is not going to leak a fake investigation, Zoe. He thinks he has a real one. Garrett has been digging through the Caldwell Logistics financial records all week. He is looking at 10 years of cash flow, and he is seeing massive recurring wire transfers leaving the main logistics accounts and going to an external third-party vendor. A vendor that just happens to be registered under my personal name." Zoe looked confused, her fingers frantically tapping on her tablet as she brought up the shadow ledgers we kept locked away. "But you only made those transfers to pay down the corporate credit lines. You were keeping them afloat." I shook my head, picking up a digital marker and drawing a heavy line down the center of the board. "No, Zoe, that is what my father thinks I did. 10 years ago, my father nearly bankrupted the entire logistics fleet. He took out incredibly predatory loans to cover his own bad investments and used the company trucks as collateral without telling anyone. When the bank finally came to repossess the fleet, he panicked. He begged me to fix it. But he flatly refused to sign over official operational control to me because his massive pride could not handle the optics of a young woman running his boardroom. So I had to get highly creative. I explained to Zoe the reality of the situation, the secret I had carried for a decade. I detailed how I had secretly established an independent holding company, an LLC completely separate from the Caldwell Family Trust. I used the initial capital from my very first consulting contracts to buy out my father's bad bank debt at a steep discount. Technically, Caldwell Logistics does not own a single truck or a single square foot of warehouse space anymore. My independent LLC owns all of it. I leased the entire operation back to my father just so he could keep his CEO title and save face in the community. Those wire transfers Garrett is seeing are not embezzlement. They are lease payments. I am not siphoning funds from Caldwell Logistics. I am their landlord, their primary secured creditor, and the absolute only reason they are not currently standing in a soup line. Zoe sank into one of the guest chairs, the realization hitting her, just as hard as it was hitting me. But Garrett does not know about the holding company, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He just sees millions of dollars moving from the family business into your private accounts. He thinks you have been draining the company dry. He thinks you are a thief. And he is going to use that fabricated narrative to throw me directly to the wolves I finished for her. The full scope of their plot suddenly crystallized in my mind. This was never just about handing a title to Lina. This was a calculated hostile corporate takeover. Garrett wanted to absorb Caldwell Logistics into his own family's East Coast portfolio. But he could not do that with a decade of catastrophic operational deficits on the books. He needed a scapegoat. He needed a rogue executive he could publicly blame for the missing millions to explain away my father's historic incompetence. He planned to frame me for embezzlement, legally seize my personal assets as restitution, and present a perfectly clean, debt-free company to the Thorne family board. My sister and my parents were not just pushing me out of the family business. They were handing me over to be slaughtered just so they could sit at the country club with the elite and pretend they had secured generational wealth. My mother was completely willing to let me face federal fraud charges just to ensure Lina got a society wedding in the papers. The sheer violent betrayal of it settled heavy in my chest. My mother skipping my graduation to fund my sister's fraudulent fashion launch in Paris was painful. But this was entirely different. This was my own flesh and blood, wrapping a legal noose around my neck to protect a man they barely knew. Garrett Thorne thought he was playing a brilliant game of corporate warfare. He genuinely believed that because he wore a custom suit and had a trust fund, he could casually bully a black woman out of her own grandfather's legacy. He thought I was just a bitter sister he could easily discard. He fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. I did not feel the urge to scream. I did not feel the urge to cry. I felt a profound, dangerous clarity wash over me, sharpening every single instinct I possessed. I was not going to step aside, and I was certainly not going to let a mediocre legacy hire strip my grandfather's hard work for parts. I walked back to my desk, picked up my phone, and bypassed my contacts list entirely. I manually dialed a number I had memorized a decade ago. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered, providing an instant grounding force in the chaos of the morning. "Attorney Thurgood Evans," the voice boomed. "Thurgood, it is Aaliyah," I said, staring out at the sprawling city skyline below my office window. Garrett Thorne just locked the Caldwell joint accounts and threatened me with a federal fraud investigation. They are trying to execute a hostile asset strip. It is time. Pull the historical files from your vault and trigger Granddad's contingency plan. I ended the call with Thurgood Evans and let the heavy silence of my office settle over me. The pieces were officially in motion. My family thought they had pinned me into a corner by freezing my accounts and threatening my reputation, but they had merely handed me the match to burn their entire house of cards to the ground. For 10 years, I had played the dutiful daughter, absorbing their insults and cleaning up their catastrophic financial blunders so they could maintain the illusion of absolute perfection. I had worn the armor of the invisible fixer for so long that they had forgotten I was the one who forged the metal. Tonight, I was taking off the armor. Tonight, they would learn exactly what happens when you try to sacrifice the only person keeping you afloat. By 8 o'clock that evening, the grand ballroom of the Biltmore Hotel was overflowing with generational wealth, political power, and the kind of high society influence my mother worshipped above all else. The annual Black Excellence Charity Gala was the crown jewel of the Atlanta social season. This year, my parents had maneuvered their way into being the lead hosts. It was a highly strategic, desperately calculated move designed entirely to legitimize Garrett Thorne in the eyes of the local elite. They needed the city's power players to view Melina's white East Coast fiancé not as a corporate interloper executing a hostile takeover, but as a benevolent partner stepping in to elevate the Caldwell name. They were using the gala to launder Garrett's sudden authority through the glittering machinery of high society. I did not wear the conservative, understated business attire my mother usually demanded of me to ensure I never outshone my sister. Instead, I wore a floor-length emerald silk gown that commanded the room the moment I stepped off the elevator. My posture was straight, my expression completely unbothered. The ambient hum of a string quartet and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes drifted out from the main hall. I bypassed the general admission line and walked directly toward the VIP entrance, where a heavy velvet rope separated the actual power players from the rest of the attendees. I barely had time to hand my coat to the attendant before my mother materialized from the thick crowd. Coretta Caldwell moved with a terrifying frantic energy, her heavy diamond necklace catching the chandelier light as she practically sprinted to intercept me. Before I could even reach the velvet rope, she grabbed my forearm. Her manicured nails dug into my skin with surprising force as she physically shoved me toward a dark alcove near the coat check, violently pulling me away from the flashing cameras of the society photographers. "What on earth are you doing here?" She hissed, her voice a venomous, panicked whisper. Her eyes darted nervously over my shoulder toward the glowing entrance of the main ballroom. "I told you to step aside gracefully. Your father and I specifically did not send you an invitation to this event. You are going to ruin this night for your sister." I looked down at her hand gripping my bare arm. I did not pull away. I simply stared at her fingers until she felt the absolute freezing calm in my gaze and slowly let go. "I am ruining the night, Mom," I asked, my voice carrying a lethal softness. "That is fascinating, considering you are currently causing a physical altercation in the lobby while the very people you want to impress are watching you lose your composure." Coretta scoffed, her face twisting with that familiar elitist disdain she usually reserved for the hired help. "You have absolutely no business being here, Aaliyah. This event is for the architects of this community. People who actually build legacies, not people who mismanage them into the ground. Garrett was kind enough to keep your little financial disaster out of the press today, but if you walk through those doors and cause a scene, I will personally see to it that your corporate clients find out exactly what kind of thief you are. You are embarrassing us in front of old money. Go home. You do not belong in that room." I smiled. It was a genuine, relaxed smile that made my mother physically take a step back. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a heavy, matte black card embossed with thick gold foil. I held it up between us, letting the light catch the metallic lettering. "You are right, Mom. You did not send me an invitation," I said smoothly, stepping around her rigid body. "I did not need one." I gestured toward the massive floral arrangements and the crystal chandeliers glowing in the main hall. "You see, when you and Dad were scrambling to find the liquid capital to host this little masquerade tonight, the event committee reached out to corporate sponsors to cover the massive deficit you created. My crisis consulting firm underwrote the entire evening. I paid for the vintage champagne you are holding. I paid for the imported orchids on the tables. I paid for the string quartet playing in the background. I am not just on the guest list, Mom. I am the premier platinum sponsor. I am the guest of honor." My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood drained from her face completely, leaving her looking hollow and terrified beneath her expensive makeup. She realized in a fraction of a second that the very ground she was standing on was bought and paid for by the daughter she was trying to throw to the wolves. I did not wait for her to formulate another insult. I turned my back on her and walked straight toward the VIP entrance. The event coordinator at the desk immediately spotted me beaming brightly as she unhooked the velvet rope and welcomed me by name loudly enough for my mother to hear. Stepping into the Biltmore ballroom felt like stepping onto a stage I had secretly built. Heads turned as I navigated through the dense crowd of tuxedoed men and women in couture gowns. I recognized several of my own corporate clients, men and women who ran massive local empires. They smiled and raised their glasses to me as I passed. My parents had spent a lifetime trying to push me to the margins, desperately attempting to hide the fact that I was the actual engine running their lives. Tonight, the margins were gone. I kept my eyes locked on the front of the room, moving with absolute purpose. The head table was elevated on a small, softly lit dais at the far end of the ballroom. Seated at the center were my father, Lina, and Garrett Thorne. They were currently surrounded by a tight, influential circle of Atlanta's most prominent Black business owners, mayors, and real estate developers. These were the men and women who had deeply respected my grandfather Elijah. These were the exact people Garrett needed to win over to legitimize his hostile takeover of our family business. I glided closer, slipping seamlessly into the shadows just behind Garrett's chair, completely unnoticed by my family. Garrett was holding a glass of scotch, leaning back with an arrogant, relaxed slouch. He was playing the benevolent savior perfectly. He was in the middle of a speech, his voice carrying clearly over the ambient noise of the ballroom, dripping with a sickening, patronizing confidence. It is really a tragedy what happens to these legacy businesses when they fail to modernize, Garrett was saying, offering a sympathetic, condescending smile to an older gentleman standing across from him, who had known my grandfather personally. Bozeman is a great man, of course. But the Caldwell Company has been bleeding capital for a decade due to severely outdated internal management. Melina and I are simply stepping in to stop the bleeding. We are bringing in East Coast capital and proper structural oversight. It is about saving Elijah Caldwell's legacy from the mismanagement of those who just did not understand macroeconomics. We cannot let a cultural staple fail just because the previous administration lacked financial literacy. Melina sat beside him, nodding solemnly, playing the flawless role of the devoted, concerned daughter, bringing salvation to her family. My father sat on the other side of the table, looking simultaneously proud of Garrett and entirely unaware that his future son-in-law was publicly calling him financially illiterate to his peers. Garrett took a sip of his scotch, chuckling softly. I always say, leave the macroeconomics to the men holding the capital, right? I took a slow, deep breath, letting Garrett's condescending words hang in the heavy air for just a fraction of a second longer. The older business owners looked mildly uncomfortable, sensing the blatant disrespect, but too polite to interrupt the groom-to-be. I stepped out of the shadows, moving directly into the bright light of the head table. I walked right up behind Garrett Thorne and placed both of my hands firmly on the back of his chair, leaning in just close enough for everyone at the table to hear me. Or perhaps I said, my voice cutting through the ambient hum of the ballroom like a polished blade. We should leave the macroeconomics to the people who actually know how to read a balance sheet without needing a trust fund to subsidize their math. Garrett stiffened immediately. The smug, relaxed posture he had been maintaining vanished as he sharply turned his head to look over his shoulder. My father nearly dropped his fork, his face draining of color as he registered my presence. The older, distinguished business owners at the table fell dead silent. I recognized Marcus Vance, a real estate mogul who had played poker with my grandfather, and Silas Montgomery, who owned half the commercial shipping lanes in the state. They were looking at me with a mixture of shock and keen predatory interest. Aaliyah, my father hissed, his voice tight with panic. He shot a desperate glance toward the VIP entrance, likely wondering how I had bypassed my mother. What are you doing here? You were not invited to this table. I am sponsoring this table, Dad, I replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact with Garrett. In fact, my firm underwrote this entire gala just to keep Caldwell Logistics from defaulting on the venue deposit. But please, Garrett, do not let me interrupt your fascinating lecture on financial literacy. You were just explaining how you are going to save my family's legacy. Garrett recovered quickly, pasting that patronizing camera-ready smile back onto his face. He stood up, buttoning his tailored jacket, attempting to physically tower over me. He wanted to assert dominance in front of the local elite. He wanted to make me look like a hysterical, disgruntled sibling. Aaliyah, it is a pleasure to see you, Garrett said, his tone dripping with forced politeness. We were just discussing the structural realities of the modern supply chain. I know you have poured a lot of your personal energy into your little consulting business, but running a multi-state logistics empire requires a different caliber of capital management. You are too close to it. You have an emotional attachment that is blinding you to the fact that Caldwell Logistics has been operating at a catastrophic deficit for 10 straight years. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply let out a short, sharp laugh that made the older men at the table exchange knowing glances. A catastrophic deficit? I repeated, stepping around his chair, so I stood completely in the open, addressing the entire table. Gentleman Garrett is referencing a deficit that only exists on the superficial operational ledgers. He is looking at the shell accounts. What he failed to mention in his brilliant macroeconomic analysis is the actual debt-to-asset ratio of the physical fleet. He claims Caldwell is bleeding capital. The truth is, Caldwell Logistics has a quarterly EBITDA margin of 22%, which outpaces the national industry average by a full 4 points. Garrett's smile faltered. His eyes narrowed as he realized I was not throwing a tantrum. I was dismantling his narrative with raw, localized data he assumed I did not have access to. "You are manipulating the numbers to save face," Aaliyah Garrett fired back, his voice losing its polished edge. "The company is drowning in leveraged debt. That is a fact." "The company is drowning in vanity projects," I corrected, instantly staring directly at my father, who shrank back into his chair. "But the core infrastructure is highly profitable. You would know that if you actually did the ground-level due diligence instead of sitting in a glass tower on the East Coast, looking for minority-owned businesses to cannibalize." Mr. Vance leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "Cannibalize," he repeated, his deep voice rumbling with sudden authority. "That is a heavy accusation, Aaliyah. Mr. Thorne here just assured us that his family is injecting fresh capital to expand the Caldwell footprint." "He is lying to you, Mr. Vance," I said, turning my full attention to the men who had known my grandfather. "Garrett Thorne has absolutely no intention of modernizing Caldwell Logistics. I have seen the preliminary filings his wealth management team quietly prepared last week. This is a textbook hostile asset strip. They are not bringing in capital. They are absorbing our established shipping routes into their own East Coast network. Once the merger goes through, they plan to liquidate the physical fleet, lay off 300 local union drivers, and sell the massive downtown warehouse plots to commercial developers for a fraction of their long-term value. He is tearing up a 50-year legacy to pad his third-quarter margins and calling it a rescue mission." The temperature at the table plummeted. Silas Montgomery set his scotch glass down with a sharp clink, glaring at Garrett. "You told us you were retaining the local workforce, Thorne. You said Elijah's name would remain on the doors. It is a corporate transition." Silas Garrett stammered, visibly sweating now, as the narrative slipped entirely out of his control. "There are necessary redundancies that must be eliminated for the sake of efficiency. Aaliyah is purposely mischaracterizing a standard reorganization because she is upset she is losing her consulting fees. She is emotional. She does not understand how high-level acquisitions work." I stepped closer to him, invading his personal space. "Do not you dare stand in this city and tell these men I do not understand business." I pointed a finger sharply at the polished mahogany table. "My grandfather, Elijah Caldwell, bought his first rig with cash he saved from working 3 jobs, because the white banks in this city refused to give a black man a commercial loan during segregation. He built a logistics empire by driving straight through sundown towns, risking his life just to deliver freight on time. He built this company with blood and calluses. He fought for a seat at the table so his children would never have to beg for one. And you think you can walk in here, flash a trust fund smile, and liquidate his life's work?" The silence that followed was absolute. The older men at the table were staring at Garrett with overt hostility now. The facade of the benevolent white savior had been completely shattered. Garrett looked cornered, his jaw clenched tight as he searched for a way to regain the upper hand. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could formulate a response, the scraping of a chair echoed across the dais. Lina stood up. She wore a custom pale gold gown that cost more than most of our drivers made in a year. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She moved around the table and placed a protective manicured hand on Garrett's arm, presenting a united front. She looked at me not as a sister, but as a minor inconvenience that was ruining her aesthetic. "Aaliyah, please," Lina said, her voice artificially sweet, coated in that same high society venom our mother used. "Stop embarrassing yourself. You are making a scene in front of our guests. Garrett is saving this family from ruin. You have spent years running yourself ragged in that cramped little office downtown playing pretend CEO. And look where it got us. We are taking the company to the next level. She offered me a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the smile of a woman who had already spent the money she was about to inherit. You are clearly stressed, she continued, projecting her voice so the surrounding tables could hear her magnanimity. You need a break. In fact, once the merger is complete and Caldwell is safely under Garrett's management, I am going to need a personal assistant to manage my schedule and handle my philanthropic engagements. I will even match your current consulting salary. It will be much less pressure for you. The sheer audacity of the offer hung in the air. She was offering to turn the granddaughter of Elijah Caldwell into her glorified secretary. My father remained completely silent, staring at his plate, allowing his eldest daughter to be publicly humiliated. I did not react to the insult. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached out and took a crystal flute of champagne from a waiter who had frozen in place near the table. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the crisp liquid cool the adrenaline rushing through my veins. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the Biltmore ballroom swung open with a resounding heavy thud. The sound was so loud, it momentarily silenced the string quartet. I smiled, looking over Melina's shoulder, as a team of men in dark, immaculate suits marched into the room, led by a tall, imposing figure carrying a thick leather briefcase. I won't be needing a job, Lina, I said, setting the champagne glass down onto the table with a soft, final clink. But you're going to need a lawyer. The heavy oak doors of the Biltmore ballroom had not just opened. They had been thrown wide with a resounding crash that echoed over the crystal glasses and polite chatter. The string quartet faltered immediately, a cellist missing a note as hundreds of heads swiveled toward the back of the room. Walking down the center aisle, commanding the space with the gravitational pull of an absolute predator, was attorney Thurgood Evans. He was a towering, broad-shouldered man, wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit and sporting a thick mane of silver hair. He moved with the slow, deliberate stride of an executioner. Flanking him on either side were four men in sharp, identical dark suits. They were not event staff. They were professional process servers, and each one held a thick, sealed leather portfolio stamped with the urgent red seal of the Fulton County Superior Court. The crowd parted for them instinctively. Wealth recognizes power, and Thurgood Evans radiated the kind of ruthless, undeniable legal authority that could liquidate a family dynasty before lunch. I watched Garrett Thorne's confident posture entirely disintegrate. The color drained from his face as his eyes locked onto Thurgood. Garrett might have possessed an inflated ego and a patronizing attitude, but he was a wealth manager at his core. He knew exactly who Thurgood Evans was. Thurgood stopped directly in front of the head table. He did not bow. He did not offer a polite society greeting to the hosts. He simply nodded to me, a silent acknowledgement between generals on a battlefield, before turning his piercing gaze onto my father. Bozeman Caldwell sat frozen, his champagne flute hovering halfway to his mouth. The distinguished guests at our table, Silas Montgomery and Marcus Vance, pushed their chairs back slightly, creating physical distance from the blast radius they knew was coming. Thurgood snapped his fingers. The four process servers stepped forward simultaneously. They moved in perfect synchronization, dropping the heavy legal portfolios directly onto the center of the VIP table. The synchronized thud shook the silverware and toppled Melina's water glass, sending a dark stain blooming across the pristine white linen. Bozeman Caldwell. Thurgood boomed his voice, a rich, authoritative baritone that required no microphone to dominate the vast ballroom. As the court-appointed executor of the late Elijah Caldwell's founding trust, I am officially serving you with formal notification. Effective immediately, the Caldwell Family Trust. Caldwell Logistics and all subsidiary corporate entities are placed under an emergency binding forensic audit. All operational accounts are frozen. All executive privileges are suspended. All pending mergers, asset transfers, or acquisitions are hereby null and void until the audit is complete. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. You could have heard a diamond pin drop on the marble floor. For 5 agonizing seconds, my father simply stared at the thick legal documents resting against his china plate. He looked at Thurgood. He looked at the gaping faces of the local business titans sitting around him. He realized that the masquerade was over. The illusion of his absolute control had been publicly, irreparably shattered in front of the exact people he was desperately trying to manipulate. And then Bozeman Caldwell erupted. He slammed his heavy fist down onto the mahogany table with a violent cracking force that sent a bread plate shattering onto the floor. The sudden violence made Lina shriek and jump backward in her custom gown. Bozeman ignored Thurgood entirely. He turned his body, his eyes wide and bloodshot with intense rage, and unleashed his fury directly at me. "You ungrateful, vindictive child," Bozeman roared, the polished veneer of the calm CEO completely evaporating. Saliva flew from his lips as he pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at my face. "You are doing this out of pure spite. You are actively destroying your own family simply because you cannot stand to see your sister happy." He stepped out from behind the table, closing the distance between us, his chest heaving. The entire ballroom was watching, completely paralyzed by the spectacle. "You have spent your entire life completely consumed by jealousy," my father shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You resent Melina's grace. You resent her charm. You are so utterly bitter that you are unmarried and sitting alone in your little office that you are willing to burn down the Caldwell name just to ruin her wedding. We bring in a respectable, powerful family to elevate our status, and you humiliate us in front of the entire city because you want to play the martyr. You are a destructive, jealous embarrassment." The cruelty of his words was meant to humiliate me into submission. It was the exact same tactic he and my mother had used since I was a teenager. They weaponized my dedication, framing my independence as a tragic flaw. They expected me to lower my head, apologize for my behavior, and retreat into the shadows to protect the precious family image. I did not retreat. I stepped forward, closing the final foot of space between us, forcing my father to look directly into the eyes of the daughter he had consistently underestimated. "I am not destroying the Caldwell name, Dad." I fired back, my voice completely devoid of hysteria, yet carrying a lethal echoing volume that reached the back of the room. "I am the only person in this building actively fighting to save it. You want to talk about elevating our status. You want to talk about a respectable family. You are completely delusional." I gestured sharply toward Garrett, who was currently shrinking back into his chair, trying desperately to avoid the hard stares of Silas Montgomery and the other established business owners. "You are not securing generational wealth," I told my father, my words slicing through the heavy silence. "You are selling out Grandfather Elijah's blood, sweat, and tears for a fake European title and a country club membership. Elijah Caldwell built that logistics fleet from absolutely nothing during segregation. He drove trucks through sundown towns while risking his life to ensure this family had a foundation. He did not build an empire so his insecure son could hand over the keys to a fraudulent trust fund kid just to buy a seat at a table you already owned." My father's face contorted, but I did not give him a single second to interrupt or deflect. I raised my voice, ensuring every investor, every local competitor, and every old money aristocrat in the room heard the absolute truth. "You want to call me jealous?" I continued, my gaze locking onto his. "You want to pretend this is about a wedding. This is about the fact that for 10 years you have treated the company's operational budget like your own personal slush fund. You gambled away the physical assets, you leveraged the trucks, you brought Caldwell Logistics to the brink of total federal bankruptcy, and you forced me to quietly absorb your massive debts through my independent firm just to keep the drivers paid and your fragile ego intact. I have spent a decade restructuring your catastrophic failures in the dark so you could stand in the light and play the brilliant CEO." My father stumbled backward slightly, the absolute truth hitting him like a physical blow. He looked around the room, seeing the shock and sudden realization dawning on the faces of his peers. Silas Montgomery was staring at Bozeman with deep, unapologetic disgust. The carefully constructed facade of the Caldwell patriarch had collapsed. I turned away from my father. He was no longer the threat. The real enemy was sitting rigidly at the table, attempting to blend into the upholstery. I walked slowly toward Garrett Thorne. He tried to maintain his arrogant posture, but his hands were visibly shaking against the white tablecloth. He looked at Thurgood Evans, then at the legal portfolios, and finally at me. He was a man who had suddenly realized he had walked into a bear trap of his own making, and the steel jaws had just snapped shut. I stopped right in front of him, bracing both of my hands firmly on the edge of the table. I leaned in, invading his space, forcing him to press his back hard against his chair. I looked dead into his eyes, watching the patronizing superiority completely dissolve into raw, unfiltered panic. He knew he had lost the board. He knew his asset strip had been blocked. I held his terrified gaze for 3 long, agonizing seconds before slowly turning my head to look at my father one last time. "Stop shouting at me about my jealousy, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp whisper that cut perfectly through the silent ballroom. "And start asking your future son-in-law where his family's supposed capital actually went." I stood up straight, smoothing the silk of my emerald gown, turning my back on the men who thought they could break me, because the emergency audit starts at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock in the morning arrived with the thick, suffocating humidity typical of an Atlanta summer, but as I walked up the sweeping marble steps of the Caldwell estate, I felt absolutely nothing but a freezing, clinical purpose. The grand Buckhead mansion, with its towering columns and perfectly manicured hedges, had always been a monument to my parents' obsession with appearances. Today, it was a crime scene. I flanked Thurgood Evans, whose heavy leather briefcase swung in perfect rhythm with his commanding, unhurried stride. Behind us followed a team of 3 sharp-eyed professionals. 2 were senior forensic accountants armed with encrypted drives and federal software. The third was Arthur Pendleton, a former federal document examiner who could spot a tampered ledger, a washed check, or a forged signature from across a crowded room. We did not bother ringing the bell. Thurgood used the heavy brass knocker with a force that rattled the frosted glass panes. When the housekeeper opened the door, her eyes widened in alarm, but I stepped past her before she could utter a word. The house was unnervingly quiet, save for the frantic, muffled sounds of raised voices echoing from the west wing. We bypassed the grand foyer and marched directly down the hall toward my father's private study. Standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the heavy mahogany doors serving as a desperate human barricade were Lina and Garrett. They looked like they had not slept for a single second. Lina's flawless aesthetic from the gala was entirely ruined. She was wearing a hastily thrown-on cashmere sweater, her eyes bloodshot, her posture rigid with terror. Garrett looked even worse. The polished East Coast aristocrat had been replaced by a cornered animal. He wore a wrinkled polo shirt, his hair disheveled, a vein pulsing furiously in his jaw as he watched our team approach. "This is private property," Aaliyah Garrett barked, holding his hand up like a traffic cop attempting to stop a freight train. "You and your hired help need to turn around and walk right back out that door. We are filing an emergency injunction against this so-called audit. You have absolutely no legal right to cross this threshold or access Bozeman's private office." I did not break my stride. I did not even look at him. Thurgood simply stepped smoothly in front of me, pulling a crisp, heavily stamped document from the inside pocket of his charcoal suit. "This is a federal court order signed at 7 this morning by Judge Harrison Thurgood," stated his rich baritone echoing off the hallway walls. "It grants me immediate unrestricted receivership of all physical and digital records pertaining to the Caldwell Family Trust. If you fail to step aside, Mr. Thorne, I will have the Fulton County Sheriff's deputies physically remove you from the premises for obstruction of a federal mandate." Garrett swallowed hard, the remaining color draining from his face. But Lina immediately stepped in front of him, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "You are not going in there," Lina hissed, her voice shrill and desperate. "Daddy is on the phone with our corporate counsel right now. You are tearing this family apart over a childish, petty vendetta. You are not going to ransack his private files just to satisfy your delusions of grandeur. We are not letting you ruin this merger." Before I could address my sister, the sharp, frantic clicking of heels on the grand staircase interrupted us. My mother Coretta descended like an avenging fury. She was tightly wrapped in a silk robe, her face devoid of her usual makeup, her eyes burning with a manic, unhinged hatred. "How dare you!" Coretta shrieked, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at my face as she stormed down the hallway. "How dare you bring strangers into this house to rifle through our personal belongings? The blatant disrespect you are showing your father, your sister, and the Caldwell name is utterly unforgivable. You are a disgrace to this family. You are trying to humiliate us in front of the entire city." I stopped. I turned slowly to face my mother, planting my feet firmly on the imported Persian rug she prized so highly. "Respect," I said, my voice dangerously low, but carrying a lethal authority that made her physically recoil. "Respect is earned, Mom. It is not an entitlement you automatically receive just because you married into a name you never helped build. You want to stand here and lecture me about disrespecting the Caldwell legacy? Look at the man standing right next to your golden child." I pointed a sharp finger directly at Garrett, who stiffened against the mahogany doors. Grandfather Elijah bled for this company. I continued my words, slicing through the morning air. He laid the physical asphalt you walk on. He fought tooth and nail in boardrooms where men who looked exactly like Garrett called him a boy and refused to shake his hand. Elijah built a fortress to protect us from a world that sneered at our culture and our skin. He worked 20-hour days swallowing his pride so his children would never have to beg for a seat at the table. And now you and Dad are practically tripping over yourselves to hand the keys to that exact fortress over to a man who mocks your husband's intelligence behind his back. I took a step closer to my mother, forcing her to look into my eyes. Garrett sits at our dinner table, drinks our grandfather's vintage liquor, and calls our heritage a mismanaged cultural staple that needs his East Coast salvation. Handing our generational wealth to an arrogant, opportunistic vulture just so you can secure a country club wedding is the ultimate disrespect to Elijah's sweat. I am not ruining this family. I am surgically removing the rot you allowed to fester. My mother opened her mouth, but the sheer, undeniable force of the truth rendered her entirely speechless. She stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing as the reality of her complicity washed over her. I turned my attention back to Melina and Garrett. "Move," I commanded. Melina hesitated, glancing nervously at Garrett, but Thurgood did not wait for their permission. He reached right past them, gripped the heavy brass handles, and shoved the doors open with a violent thrust. The study was a catastrophic disaster. The smell of burning paper and stale coffee hit us immediately. Files were strewn recklessly across my father's massive leather-topped desk. The heavy-duty commercial shredder in the corner was glowing a dull, angry red, indicating it had been running hot all morning. A trash can was overflowing with curled, destroyed documents. Bozeman was not in the room, likely hiding in his private sitting area, making frantic, useless calls to lawyers who could no longer save him. "Arthur," I said, gesturing to the chaos, "do what you do best." Arthur Pendleton walked calmly into the room, setting his metal briefcase on a side table and snapping on a pair of tight latex gloves. Garrett rushed in behind us, his panic now entirely unmasked, his hands hovering over the desk. "You cannot touch those," Garrett yelled. "Those are privileged communications. This is a massive violation of privacy. You are overstepping your legal bounds. Everything in this room pertains to the Caldwell Family Trust, which is now under the strict receivership of this audit," Thurgood stated, casually stepping into Garrett's path and blocking him from the desk. "If you interfere with my examiner, Mr. Thorne, you will leave this house in handcuffs." Garrett froze. His jaw worked furiously, but the threat of a public arrest kept him rooted to the spot. Melina hovered in the doorway, chewing frantically on her thumbnail, the image of the poised, untouchable socialite completely obliterated. Arthur moved methodically, a veteran of 1,000 corporate raids. He ignored the obvious superficial decoys scattered on top of the desk and went straight for the heavy iron wall safe, hidden behind a bookshelf, which had been left hastily unlocked in someone's blind panic. He pulled out a stack of thick, pristine manila folders. These were not the sanitized operational ledgers my father presented at board meetings. These were the raw, unfiltered master files. The room was suffocatingly tense. The only sound was the crisp rustling of heavy paper as Arthur flipped through a specific file marked with a prominent red tag. He pulled a jeweler's magnifying loupe from his breast pocket and leaned closely over a freshly printed document. He traced the ink with his eyes, comparing the pressure marks and stroke patterns to a stack of older verified contracts sitting nearby. He paused. He tilted the paper toward the bright morning light streaming through the bay windows. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone in the room. Melina took a sharp, unsteady breath. Arthur slowly lowered his magnifying loupe. He placed the document perfectly flat on the center of the desk, stepping back to let Thurgood and me see it clearly. It was the heavily contested, newly updated power of attorney. It was the exact document my father had supposedly signed just last week, the one granting Melina total unchecked control over the voting shares of the Caldwell Trust. The very document that gave her the authority to push Garrett's hostile merger through without requiring my consent. Arthur looked up. His expression was completely blank, a professional void of any emotion. He turned his gaze toward the doorway where my sister was trembling. Miss Caldwell, the examiner, said, his voice dropping like an anvil into the dead silence of the study. This signature is a complete forgery. The heavy silence in the room stretched so thin it felt like it might snap and take off someone's head. Melina stumbled back, her heel catching on the edge of the Persian rug. She grabbed the back of a leather armchair to steady herself, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Arthur did not wait for a confession. He tapped the center of the document with his gloved index finger. The ink overlay is entirely inconsistent with a live, continuous stroke. Arthur stated, his voice clinical and completely devoid of pity. There is zero pressure variation. What you are looking at is a high-resolution scan. Specifically, it is a direct isolated copy of Elijah Caldwell's signature. I have compared the unique curvature of the baseline, and it is an exact pixel-for-pixel match to the signature on the 2018 corporate holiday greeting card. You can even see the micropixelation on the tail of the W, where the glossy cardstock distorted the original scan. I stepped past Thurgood, moving so close to my sister I could smell the sharp metallic tang of fear cutting through her expensive perfume. "A holiday card, Lina?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "You stole control of a $50 million logistics empire using a greeting card. I always knew you were lazy, but I honestly expected a little more effort for corporate treason." "I did not do this!" Melina choked out, tears finally spilling over her lashes, ruining her carefully applied makeup. She looked wildly toward the hallway where our mother stood frozen, then toward Garrett. "I did not sign anything. Daddy said the lawyers handled all the paperwork. Daddy said it was all completely legal and ready to file." "Daddy is a coward who has spent his entire life terrified of the empire he inherited," I shot back, my voice rising just enough to command the entire room. Grandfather Elijah knew it too. He knew Bozeman cared more about securing his spot at the Buckhead Country Club than he did about the men driving the rigs. "Do you remember what Grandfather said the night before his final stroke?" Melina shook her head frantically, pressing herself further into the chair. "Of course you do not remember," I said, my words dropping like heavy stones. "You were at a spa retreat in Sedona. But I was there. I was sitting right next to his hospital bed. He grabbed my wrist and his hands were still rough. He told me that the commercial land trust, the actual dirt and concrete that keeps this family breathing, would never go to someone with soft hands. He said the legacy only belongs to the grandchild who has calluses from doing the actual work." Bozeman conveniently forgot that deathbed promise the second he realized he needed Garrett's fake prestige to pay off his massive vanity debts. My mother, still hovering in the hallway, let out a choked sob. She knew it was true. She had stood by while Bozeman bled the operational accounts dry to fund their social climbing. Garrett Thorne finally snapped. The polished East Coast composure he had weaponized for months completely dissolved into raw, ugly aggression. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us in 2 heavy strides. He stopped mere inches from my face, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me, his chest heaving. "You think this little parlor trick changes anything?" Garrett spat, pointing a shaking finger directly at my eyes. You think bringing in a hired gun to look at a piece of paper stops a multi-state acquisition? I will bury you in so much litigation you will spend the rest of your pathetic life paying legal fees just to keep your own apartment. Caldwell Logistics is drowning. We hold the debt. We hold the leverage. You are nothing but a disgruntled consultant playing dress-up. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I looked up at his red, contorted face and waited. Arrogant men always overplay their hands when they feel cornered. They cannot stand being outmaneuvered by someone they consider beneath them. You have no leverage, Garrett, I said with absolute chilling certainty, because a forged power of attorney invalidates every single merger document you signed with my father. You do not own the fleet. You do not own the roots. You own nothing. You stupid, arrogant girl! Garrett snarled, the vein in his neck pulsing furiously as his rage overrode his heavily expensive education. Do you really think my board cares about a technicality on a signature? We already leveraged the downtown warehouse deeds against our own offshore credit lines 3 weeks ago. The capital is already integrated. You cannot unwind a deal that has already bought and paid for your father's silence. The room went perfectly entirely dead. Garrett's eyes widened in sudden, absolute horror as his own words caught up with his brain. He froze, his hand still suspended in the air. He had just admitted in front of a federal receiver and a forensic examiner that his firm had actively leveraged Caldwell assets offshore 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, the forged power of attorney had not even been drafted. He had just confessed to premeditated corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. Behind me, Thurgood Evans let out a low, satisfied hum. Arthur Pendleton calmly reached into his briefcase and pulled out a fresh blank evidence log. Thank you for clarifying that timeline, Mr. Thorne Thurgood said, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls with the finality of a judge's gavel. Garrett's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. The sophisticated veneer of the Thorne family heir completely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but a desperate, cornered man. He stepped away from the mahogany doors and lunged toward the desk, his hands balling into fists as he aggressively closed the distance between us. Thurgood immediately shifted his weight, placing his large frame subtly between Garrett and Arthur, but I held my ground. I wanted Garrett to speak. I wanted him to lose his temper. You are playing a very dangerous game, Garrett snarled, his voice vibrating with a frantic, unhinged energy. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. You think finding a technical discrepancy on one piece of paper stops a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition? Thorne Capital has a small army of litigators who will bury you, your little crisis firm, and this entire family in court until you are bleeding cash. We are the only thing keeping Caldwell Logistics out of federal bankruptcy. I tilted my head, studying him with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a dying specimen. He was sweating through his expensive polo shirt. His breathing was shallow and rapid. You are overstepping. Garrett continued, his volume rising as panic overrode his elite conditioning. He slammed his hand down on the edge of my father's desk. If that land title is not cleared by Friday, Thorne Capital is pulling out entirely. We will walk away, cancel the merger, and leave you all completely bankrupt. The word Friday hung in the stifling air of the study. Time seemed to slow down. My crisis management brain, trained to dissect corporate rhetoric and locate the hidden liabilities, locked onto his exact phrasing. If a private equity firm was simply acquiring a failing logistics company to inject liquid capital and restructure its operations, the specific clearance of physical land titles by a strict Friday deadline would not be a deal-breaker. Acquiring operations takes months, but needing unencumbered land titles cleared in 48 hours meant only one thing. They did not need the company. They needed the collateral. I stared at Garrett, watching the erratic pulse in his neck. I played back every conversation I had ever heard about Thorne Capital. They were heavily invested in East Coast commercial real estate, a sector that had taken a massive, unprecedented hit over the last 2 quarters. The pieces snapped together with a sickening, brilliant clarity. Thorne Capital is pulling out, I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm whisper. Garrett swallowed hard, his eyes darting away from mine for a fraction of a second. It was the micro-expression of a man who realized he had just handed his executioner the rope. "You are not bringing capital into this company," I said, taking a slow step toward him. "You don't have any capital. Thorn Capital is completely underwater." "That is slander," Garrett choked out, but he backed away, bumping into the heavy leather armchair behind him. "It is basic financial forensics," I countered, my voice gaining strength and echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Your family's hedge fund made catastrophic bets on commercial real estate up north. The market tanked, your lenders issued margin calls, and you suddenly found yourselves drowning in debt. You did not come down to Atlanta looking to expand your footprint, Garrett. You came down here hunting for a life raft." I turned slightly to look at my mother, who was standing frozen in the hallway, her silk robe clutched tightly to her chest. Then I looked at my father, who had just stepped out of his private sitting room, his face ashen as he listened to his entire world unravel. "Grandfather Elijah bought the downtown warehouse district in 1974. I said, making sure my parents heard every single syllable. "He paid cash. He never took out a mortgage. It is 50 acres of prime, debt-free industrial land sitting in the middle of one of the fastest-growing metropolitan areas in the South. That land is worth a fortune in pure equity." Garrett didn't want the trucks. He didn't want the shipping routes. He needed Elijah Caldwell's unencumbered real estate so he could leverage it against his own Wall Street losses and save his family from federal indictment. I turned back to Garrett, letting a cold, genuine laugh escape my lips. The sound made him physically flinch. "You are broke," I stated, stripping away the last remaining shred of his aristocratic dignity. "Your entire East Coast empire is a hollow shell, and you targeted my desperate, socially climbing sister because you knew she was insecure enough to trade her grandfather's blood sweat for the illusion of a wealthy white savior. You are not a billionaire investor, Garrett. You are a glorified con artist trying to steal a dead black man's land to pay your bills." My father let out a ragged, devastated breath, sinking against the doorframe of his sitting room. He had mortgaged his soul to this man, believing he was securing a legacy, only to realize he had handed a match to an arsonist. My mother covered her mouth with her hand, a look of absolute horror washing over her face as she looked at Garrett's sweating, guilty expression. The truth was undeniable. The savior was a fraud. But Lina could not accept it. Her entire identity, her upcoming high society wedding, the magazine spreads, the country club validations. It was all tied to the illusion of Garrett Thorne's wealth. If Garrett was a fraud, then Lina was a fool. And Lina Caldwell would rather burn the world down than admit she had been played. She stepped out from the corner of the room, pushing past Garrett. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, frantic rage. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest, her chest heaving as she prepared to defend her crumbling fairy tale. "You think you're so smart?" Lina screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical desperation. "Dad signed the estate transfer papers to me yesterday. The house and the company are mine no matter what." The study felt entirely devoid of oxygen. Lina's screams tore through the heavy silence, bouncing off the mahogany bookshelves and the framed photos of our grandfather. She stood panting, her chest rising and falling in erratic jerks. Her perfectly manicured hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white with the strain. She truly believed those signed transfer papers were her impenetrable shield. She thought the ink of our cowardly father could magically erase the forensic evidence sitting flat on the desk right in front of her. I looked at her. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. The sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from her pores was almost suffocating, but it washed over me like water over stone. Arthur Pendleton did not even pause his work. He simply turned back to the iron safe, his latex-gloved hands methodically pulling out more ledgers, utterly indifferent to a spoiled heiress throwing a temper tantrum. Thurgood stood beside me, a silent, immovable mountain of legal authority, watching the Caldwell family implode with clinical detachment. "You signed the estate transfer papers yesterday," I repeated, my voice dropping an octave, slipping into a terrifyingly conversational tone. "Yes," Lina snapped, a desperate, triumphant smirk breaking through her tears. She took a step forward, suddenly emboldened by her own delusion. Daddy signed everything over to me. Full control of the voting shares, full control of the downtown commercial trust. The merger with Thorn Capital is locked. You are too late, Aaliyah. You can bring in all the federal auditors you want, but you cannot touch my property. I own Caldwell Logistics. My mother, Coretta, let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief from the hallway. She reached out and gripped Garrett's arm, treating him like the anchor that would keep them all from drowning. Garrett, however, did not look relieved. The sweat on his forehead had gathered into thick droplets. His eyes darted nervously between the forged power of attorney on the desk and my perfectly calm face. He knew how the game was played, and he knew a checkmate when he saw one. I slowly unzipped the front pocket of my leather portfolio. I did not rush. I let the agonizing sound of the zipper echo in the dead air. I reached inside and pulled out my sleek black tablet. The screen woke up with a soft glow illuminating the sharp angles of my face in the dim morning light. I tapped the screen once, twice. Then I held it casually by my side, not even bothering to show it to them yet. "Do you remember last month, Lina?" I asked, taking one slow, deliberate step toward her. "Do you remember the night of the Founders Gala? You were wearing that ridiculous emerald silk gown you spent 3 months tracking down just to impress Garrett's mother." Melina's smirk faltered. Her eyes flicked down to the tablet in my hand, then back up to my face. "What does that have to do with anything?" I walked into the dining room right before the first course was served. I continued, my voice steady, weaving the memory into the room like a physical trap. "I did not stay for dinner. I just walked right up to your seat, dropped a thick sealed manila envelope on your plate, and walked out." My father groaned from the doorway, burying his face in his hands. He remembered. The entire house remembered. "You opened it," I said, taking another step closer. "And you screamed so loudly the catering staff dropped a tray of champagne glasses. You screamed, 'You are joking!' in front of 30 of Atlanta's most influential socialites. Do you remember what was in that envelope, Lina?" Melina swallowed hard. The remaining color in her cheeks completely vanished. "It was a draft," she whispered, her voice shaking so badly the words barely formed. "It was a fake draft of an injunction. You were just trying to scare me. You were trying to ruin my engagement party." "It was not a fake draft," I corrected, my tone sharpening into a blade. "It was a preliminary filing for a federal receivership audit. It was the exact document Thurgood handed you 20 minutes ago. But that was not the only thing in the envelope, was it?" I raised the tablet, the screen displaying a high-resolution, digitally stamped legal document. I swiped to the second page, highlighting a massive block of dense, heavily redacted financial text. Garrett pushed past my mother, his eyes wide with a sudden feral terror as he tried to get a look at the screen. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "What are you looking at?" I ignored him entirely, keeping my eyes locked on my sister. "I gave you that envelope to warn you," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "I handed you the exact financial layout of Thorn Capital's massive offshore debt. I handed you the proof that Garrett was bankrupt. I handed you the evidence that he was using you to steal grandfather Elijah's land to save his own miserable life. I gave you the truth, Melina. I gave you the key to save yourself. And what did you do?" Melina backed away, shaking her head. No. Daddy said the lawyers vetted him. Daddy said it was a perfect match." "You threw it in the fireplace," I stated, the finality of my words striking her like physical blows. "You burned the evidence because you wanted a country club wedding more than you wanted to protect your own blood. You wanted to be a thorn so badly that you rushed the estate transfer. You bullied a weak, terrified father into signing over the legacy yesterday because you thought I was going to stop the merger today." I let out a short, hollow laugh that held absolutely no humor. It was a cold, metallic sound that made Garrett physically recoil. "You think you outsmarted me, Lina. You think transferring the estate yesterday saved you. All you did was legally bind yourself to a massive multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud investigation. By transferring the estate under a forged power of attorney, you did not secure the company. You just made yourself the primary target for the FBI. You handed Garrett the land, and in exchange he is going to let you take the fall for his empty hedge fund." Garrett opened his mouth to scream a denial, but no sound came out. He was completely trapped, suffocating under the weight of his own exposure. My mother began to openly weep, sinking against the hallway wall, as the illusion of her perfect aristocratic family shattered into a million irreparable pieces. My father remained silent, a broken, useless shadow of a man. Melina fell into the leather chair, her entire body shaking as she gasped for air. Her eyes were wide, staring at the tablet in my hand, as if it were a loaded gun pointed directly at her chest. "You only read the first page of that envelope, Lina," I said coldly, turning the tablet off and sliding it smoothly back into my portfolio. "I highly suggest you bring your fiancé and his lawyers to Thurgood's office at noon. Let's read page 2 together." Exactly. At noon, the heavy frosted glass doors of Evans and Associates swung open. Thurgood's law firm occupied the entire 45th floor of a sleek modern high-rise in downtown Atlanta, a fortress of steel-polished concrete and panoramic views of the city. The boardroom itself was designed for intimidation. It featured a massive 20-foot-long table carved from a single slab of black marble, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling metropolitan grid. Somewhere down there, fleets of Caldwell logistics trucks were moving freight entirely unaware of the bloodbath about to occur high above them. When the doors opened, the silence of the room was immediately shattered by the aggressive synchronized marching of heavy leather shoes. Garrett Thorne led the procession, having entirely reconstructed his mask of East Coast superiority. His panic from the morning had been shoved down and replaced by a lethal manufactured arrogance. Flanking him were two men in impeccably tailored dark navy suits. They carried identical brushed aluminum briefcases and wore the predatory bored expressions of high-priced corporate litigators who were used to crushing smaller firms into dust. Behind the legal wall came my family. Bozeman walked with a slow, shuffling gait. His shoulders slumped as if gravity was actively trying to pull him through the floor. He refused to look in my direction. Melina clung tightly to his arm, her earlier tears replaced by a hard, brittle smugness. She held a thick leather binder against her chest like a physical shield. Bringing up the rear was my mother. Coretta swept into the room with her chin held high, her eyes scanning the sleek, expensive architecture of Thurgood's firm with thinly veiled disdain. She wanted to project absolute authority, to prove that she was not intimidated by the space or by me. She marched toward the center of the room, stopping to glare at me where I stood by the window. "Take a seat against the wall, Aaliyah." Coretta commanded, her voice ringing with the familiar, condescending tone she had used on me since I was a child. "We are going to put a quick end to this ridiculous, embarrassing tantrum. I suggest you sit quietly in the back, keep your mouth shut, and watch how real business is handled by professionals." For 29 years, I had obeyed that exact tone. I had sat at the edge of the room. I had stayed in the background while Melina was pushed into the spotlight. I had swallowed my opinions, hidden my intelligence, and allowed myself to be treated as the unfortunate, unremarkable scapegoat of the Caldwell family. I was the daughter they tolerated, never the daughter they respected. I looked at my mother. I did not say a word. I simply turned away from the window and walked directly toward the immense black marble table. Garrett's lead attorney was already moving to claim the head chair, assuming his position of dominance. I did not break my stride. I reached the head of the table a fraction of a second before he did, placing my hand firmly on the back of the leather chair. The attorney paused, offering a condescending, tight-lipped smile, expecting me to step aside for him. I pulled the chair out and sat down. I adjusted my jacket, placed my hands flat on the cool marble, and looked down the length of the 20-foot table at the people who had spent my entire life telling me I was less than them. The visual impact was immediate and devastating. By taking the head of the table, I claimed absolute control of the room, the meeting, and the narrative. I broke the scapegoat mold permanently, forcing my parents and my sister to look at me not as an afterthought, but as the executioner. Coretta's mouth fell open in shock. Melina gripped her binder tighter, her knuckles turning white. Garrett's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking violently in his cheek, as he was forced to take a seat along the side directly opposite Thurgood Evans. Arthur Pendleton sat quietly to my right, his forensic files neatly stacked. "Let us skip the pleasantries," Garrett's lead attorney announced, remaining standing to project authority. My name is Vance Sterling. I represent Thorn Capital, and by extension the pending merger with Caldwell Logistics. We are here to formally demand the immediate dissolution of this completely baseless federal receivership. Thurgood leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together over his stomach. He looked completely unbothered. On what grounds, Mr. Sterling? On the grounds that you have no legal standing to audit a company that your client no longer has any claim to. Vance shot back, his voice dripping with aggressive confidence. You secured a receiver audit based on the premise that Bozeman Caldwell's assets were in jeopardy due to mismanagement. But as of yesterday evening, Bozeman Caldwell is no longer the controlling entity of the Caldwell Family Trust, the operational fleet, or the commercial real estate downtown. Lina sat up straighter, a victorious smile spreading across her face. She practically shoved the leather binder toward Vance. My client, Lina Caldwell, is now the sole proprietor and managing director of the entire estate. Vance continued, his voice echoing off the marble table. The transfer was executed legally, signed by Bozeman, and notarized. The assets are hers, and she has fully authorized the merger with Thorn Capital. Your audit is dead in the water. Your injunction is moot. You are trespassing on my client's corporate property. Vance reached into the binder and pulled out a thick, heavily stamped stack of legal documents. He held them up for a moment to ensure everyone in the room recognized their significance. With a theatrical, aggressive motion, he slapped the estate transfer deed down onto the center of the marble table. The sharp crack echoed through the boardroom. We expect the receivership dissolved by 3 o'clock this afternoon, Vance demanded, leaning over the table, trying to bore a hole through Thurgood with his eyes. If you refuse, we will file for immediate sanctions, and I will personally see to it that this firm is investigated for malicious litigation. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Lina looked at me, her eyes gleaming with a vicious, triumphant joy. She thought she had won. She thought the ink on that page erased the fraud, the embezzlement, and the absolute destruction Garrett was about to bring down on our family. Thurgood Evans did not flinch. He did not look intimidated. He slowly leaned forward, reaching out with one large hand to pull the transfer deed toward him. He glanced at the first page, his expression entirely blank, void of any legal panic. Then, with a casual, almost bored flick of his wrist, Thurgood pushed the stack of documents right back across the slick marble. This paper is worthless. Vance Sterling's face turned a mottled shade of red. He planted his palms flat on the black marble, leaning aggressively toward Thurgood. Worthless. That document was executed by a senior partner at my firm. It is signed by the standing CEO, fully notarized, and filed with the state of Georgia. It grants Lina Caldwell total executive authority and ownership of Caldwell Logistics. Thurgood Evans did not raise his voice. He simply adjusted his glasses and pulled a remarkably thick, leather-bound folio from his own briefcase. Mr. Sterling, your document is legally sound. Your due diligence, however, is a professional embarrassment. Thurgood flipped the folio open, the crisp sound of heavy parchment cutting through the room. I am holding the original corporate charter of Caldwell Logistics, along with the fully updated, privately audited asset ledger. Section 4, Paragraph 2, clearly stipulates that the executive transfer of the corporate entity does not automatically encompass the physical assets if those assets are held by a separate controlling trust. Garrett scoffed loudly, waving a dismissive hand. We already reviewed the trust documents. The Caldwell Family Trust owns the fleet and the physical real estate. Lina just took control of the trust. Ergo, Lina owns the assets. This is first-year law school posturing. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the marble. You reviewed the trust documents Bozeman gave you, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal calm. You reviewed the sanitized public-facing ledgers my father specifically prepared to make himself look like a competent businessman. You did not review the actual ownership titles because if you had, you would have noticed a catastrophic gap in your timeline. I turned my gaze to my father. Bozeman was shrinking into his chair, his eyes fixed firmly on the polished surface of the table. He looked like a man watching his own execution in slow motion. Tell them what happened 5 years ago, Dad, I commanded. The room was dead silent. Bozeman did not move. He did not speak. He just sat there, breathing shallowly. Fine, I said, holding his gaze. I will tell them. 5 years ago, while Melina was spending 6 months backpacking through Europe, on the company credit card, Bozeman made a massive unhedged bet on a regional expansion into the Midwest. He bought out a failing distribution network, thinking he could flip it. He was wrong. The network collapsed, the debt matured, and Caldwell Logistics was exactly 3 weeks away from a highly public, entirely humiliating federal bankruptcy. Coretta gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. Bozeman, what is she talking about? The company had a record year 5 years ago. The company had a record year because of me, Mom, I stated, shifting my focus to her. Bozeman was terrified. He knew Grandfather Elijah would roll over in his grave if the Caldwell name was dragged through bankruptcy court. He knew his precious country club buddies would turn their backs on him. He needed an immediate, massive injection of liquid cash to cover the margin calls and hide the losses. But no bank would lend to him. His credit was toxic. I looked back at Garrett and his high-priced lawyers. Vance Sterling was no longer smirking. He was rapidly texting someone under the table, his brow furrowed in sudden anxiety. So Bozeman did the only thing a desperate coward could do. I continued savoring the absolute destruction of their arrogant assumptions. He held a quiet, private fire sale. He liquidated the physical foundation of Caldwell Logistics. He sold the entire fleet of 500 commercial transport trucks. He sold the titles to the 3 regional distribution hubs. He sold the heavy machinery, the maintenance bays, and the shipping containers. Melina let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. You are lying. The trucks are out there right now. They have our name painted on the side. I saw the dispatch logs yesterday. We own a massive fleet. You operate a massive fleet. Lina, I corrected, my tone dripping with icy precision. You do not own a single lug nut. I opened my portfolio and slid a single crisp sheet of paper down the center of the table. It glided over the black marble and stopped exactly in front of Vance Sterling. When Bozeman panicked, I took the inheritance. Grandfather Elijah left me in his private trust. I explained the truth, finally stepping out into the light. I formed an independent holding company, and I bought it all. Every single truck, every single warehouse, every piece of heavy machinery. I paid off Bozeman's toxic debt in cash, and in return he signed over the absolute physical ownership of Caldwell Logistics to my holding company. Garrett snatched the paper from in front of his lawyer. His eyes scanned the document rapidly, his face draining of all remaining color. To save face, to keep up the illusion that he was still the king of the castle, I allowed Bozeman to lease the fleet and the warehouses back from me, I said, leaning back in my chair and watching the devastation take hold. Caldwell Logistics is nothing but a management shell. It is a tenant. It operates the routes, but it owns absolutely zero physical assets. Vance Sterling grabbed the paper from Garrett. He stared at it, his mouth slightly open, the realization of his own professional negligence hitting him like a freight train. This is an LLC. Vance mumbled, his aggressive confidence entirely evaporated. Apex Industrial Holdings. Yes, Thurgood Evans stated cheerfully, tapping his pen against his notepad. A private limited liability corporation. And if you check the articles of incorporation attached to that summary, you will see the sole proprietor and exclusive shareholder. Vance flipped to the second page. He stared at the name printed in bold black ink. He slowly lowered the document to the table, looking at me with a mixture of professional horror and genuine fear. Melina snatched the paper next. She read the name. She read it again. Her hands began to shake violently. Me, I said, answering the unasked question hanging in the suffocating air of the boardroom. I own Apex Industrial Holdings, which means I own the trucks. I own the distribution hubs. I own the concrete your desk sits on. Bozeman let out a pathetic, broken sound, finally burying his face in his hands. He knew this day would come. He had just hoped he would be dead or retired before the bill came due. He had transferred the Caldwell Logistics corporate entity to his favorite daughter, completely aware that he was handing her an empty box. Melina dropped the paper. She looked at our father, her eyes wide with betrayal. Daddy, is this true? You gave me a company that owns nothing. Bozeman did not answer. He just kept his face hidden, too ashamed to look at the golden child he had just ruined. Garrett Thorne was breathing heavily, his hands gripping the edge of the marble table so tightly his knuckles were white. His entire plan, his entire scheme to save his bankrupt East Coast hedge fund by liquidating Caldwell's hard assets, had just vanished into thin air. He had spent months manipulating Lina, flattering Coretta, and intimidating Bozeman, all to acquire a company that was legally bound to pay rent to me. "This is fraud," Garrett choked out, but the fight had completely left his voice. "We can pierce the corporate veil. We can litigate this. You cannot litigate a standard commercial lease agreement," Mr. Thorne Thurgood Evans replied smoothly, a dangerous edge creeping into his rich baritone. "The sales were fully taxed, reported, and publicly filed 5 years ago. You just failed to look past the hood ornament." The two high-priced corporate lawyers flanking Garrett were no longer looking at Thurgood or me. They were looking at Garrett with outright fury. They had staked their firm's reputation on this merger, and Garrett had fed them incomplete intelligence. Lina was hyperventilating, pressing her hands to her temples. "But I own the operations. I still own the corporate entity. I am the CEO." I looked down the length of the table at my sister, watching her desperately cling to the meaningless title she had manipulated our father to get. She was the CEO of an empty shell, a captain of a sinking leased ship. "Yes, Lina," I said softly, a cold smile finally touching my lips. "You are the CEO. You own the corporate entity, which means you also own the operational debt. But we are not quite finished here." I did not give them a single moment to catch their breath. The shock paralyzing the room was a weapon, and I intended to wield it with absolute unforgiving precision. Lina stared at me with vacant, glassy eyes, her mind completely short-circuiting as the reality of her empty throne sank into her bones. She clutched the worthless transfer deed to her chest, as if the leather binder could somehow magically restore the empire she thought she had stolen. Garrett, however, possessed the frantic, destructive energy of a cornered predator. He slammed his hand flat onto the black marble table, leaning forward until his expensive, heavy cologne aggressively fought the sterile air of the boardroom. "You are playing a cute game with lease agreements, Aaliyah." Garrett snarled, his voice vibrating with a desperate, manic authority. He pointed a trembling, accusing finger directly at my face. "But you seem to forget exactly who holds the operational leverage in this room. 6 months ago, Caldwell Logistics was bleeding out on the operating table. The corporate entity was drowning in toxic bank debt, facing immediate federal foreclosure. Your father came to me on his knees. I injected $510,000 of pure liquid capital into this company to keep the lights on and the creditors away. That makes Thorne Capital the primary stakeholder. I own the corporate debt, which means I own your little sister. And by extension, I can dissolve those equipment leases in a bankruptcy court tomorrow morning." I let his words hang in the heavy air. I looked at Garrett, watching the erratic pulse beating against his collar, and then I looked at Bozeman. My father was actively shrinking into his leather chair, trying to melt into the upholstery and become entirely invisible. "You injected $510,000? I repeated slowly, letting the precise number roll off my tongue like a verdict. "You told my father that money came from the Thorne family trust. You told him it was old money, a show of extreme good faith and financial security for your impending marriage into the Caldwell family." "That is exactly what it was." Garrett snapped back, his chest puffing out slightly as he tried to reclaim his stolen dignity in front of his lawyers. "And that capital gives me the absolute power to dismantle this company piece by piece to recoup my investment." I turned my gaze to Arthur Pendleton. The quiet, meticulous forensic accountant did not say a word. He simply offered a thin, razor-sharp smile and slid a heavy blue legal folder across the table toward me. I opened it deliberately, taking my time, and extracted a stack of heavily stamped certified bank receipts. I looked back at Garrett. The false bravado on his face was already beginning to fracture into genuine panic. I lifted the first receipt from the stack and slid it across the smooth black marble. It glided effortlessly, stopping directly beneath his trembling hand. "That is the certified record of the wire transfer from 6 months ago," I stated, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "The exact amount of $510,000. The exact amount required to stop the regional bank from seizing the Caldwell Logistics corporate accounts and liquidating the management structure." Garrett stared down at the paper. His attorneys Vance Sterling and his silent partner leaned in to read the document. Vance let out a sharp, ragged exhale, violently running a hand over his face as if he were trying to wake up from a nightmare. Garrett swallowed hard. "This proves my point," he said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. It sounded hollow and reedy. "This proves the capital injection. This proves I saved the company. Read the routing origin." Mr. Sterling Thurgood Evans chimed in his deep baritone voice, carrying a note of profound, dangerous amusement. "Read it aloud for the entire room, please. I want to make sure it is on the official record." Vance Sterling did not speak. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine, heard the distinct mechanical click, and realized his career was about to be blown into ash. He slowly backed away from the table, putting physical distance between himself and his client. "Since your high-priced counsel has suddenly lost his voice, I will read it for you," I said, leaning forward and resting my chin on my folded hands. "That wire transfer did not originate from Thorn Capital. It did not come from an offshore trust, a lucrative hedge fund, or any old money family account. Thorn Capital was completely bankrupt 6 months ago. You did not have $500 to your name, Garrett, let alone $500,000. Melina whipped her head around to stare at her fiancé. "Garrett, what is she talking about? You showed Daddy the wire transfer. You paid the bank. You saved us from the foreclosure." He showed Bozeman a routing number. I corrected, my eyes never leaving Garrett's sweating, pale face. "He showed our desperate father a receipt of payment to the bank to stop the foreclosure. But Garrett did not make that payment." I slid the second document across the table. It was the formal deed of assignment for the corporate debt. "I did," I said. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a devastating earthquake. Coretta stopped breathing entirely. Bozeman let out a soft, pathetic whimper. Melina looked back and forth between me and the stamped paper, her brain aggressively refusing to process the words I had just spoken. 6 months ago, the primary lender for Caldwell Logistics initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings. I explained, keeping my tone strictly conversational, as if we were discussing the weather rather than their total destruction. Bozeman panicked. He went to Garrett begging for a lifeline to save his reputation. Garrett realized he had the perfect opportunity to play the wealthy savior, to lock Melina down before the wedding, and gain unlimited access to what he thought was a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio. But Garrett had no money, so Garrett came to me. Garrett's face turned an ugly mottled shade of purple. He opened his mouth to scream, to deny it, to threaten me with litigation, but I simply held up a single finger, silencing him instantly. The gesture carried decades of suppressed authority. Garrett came to my office. I continued, ensuring every single person in the room heard the pathetic truth. He begged me to front the cash. He knew I had the liquid capital hidden inside Apex Industrial Holdings. He promised me that if I funded the bailout and let him take the credit, he would structure the impending merger to ensure I received a prominent, highly paid seat on the board. He wanted to use my own money to buy my family's company and then offer me a job as a reward for my silence. I let out a harsh, metallic laugh that sent a visible shiver down Melina's spine. "But I do not want a seat on your imaginary board, Garrett," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous register. "And I certainly do not want a job at a failing management firm. When I paid off that $500,000 debt, I did not do it as an anonymous donor. I bought the debt. I purchased the promissory notes directly from the bank." I turned to look at my father. Bozeman was violently trembling, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair as if he were strapped into a roller coaster hurtling toward a concrete wall. "I am not an employee. You can fire Dad," I stated, twisting the knife and watching him bleed. "I am not the scapegoat daughter you can push to the back of the room anymore. I am the primary secured creditor of Caldwell Logistics. I own the debt. I hold the markers. Melina does not own a company. She owns a massive financial liability payable directly to me. I shifted my gaze to my mother. Coretta was staring at me with a look of absolute, unadulterated horror. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to have lost its luster. Her manicured hands were shaking uncontrollably in her lap. And since Bozeman was completely desperate 6 months ago, I added smoothly, I required collateral to secure that $510,000 loan. Standard corporate policy dictates that personal assets must be leveraged when corporate accounts are severely overdrawn and credit is toxic. Coretta let out a sudden sharp gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth, her manicured nails digging into her cheeks. She understood. The matriarch of the Caldwell family, the woman who had spent her entire life ruthlessly curating an image of flawless wealth and social superiority, finally understood exactly what I had done. "You put up the house!" Coretta choked out her voice, a fragile, broken whisper that sounded entirely foreign coming from her throat. She turned to Bozeman, striking his shoulder with a trembling, uncoordinated fist. "You let her put a lien on the house." It was the only way. Bozeman cried out, his voice cracking with cowardly desperation as he tried to shield himself from his wife's blows. "We were going to lose the company, Coretta. Garrett said he was going to pay her back with interest after the merger went through. Garrett promised me he had the capital coming from New York." Coretta began to cry. Deep, racking, humiliating sobs tore through her chest as the illusion of her perfect life evaporated into smoke. The grand estate in Buckhead, the country club dinners, the designer clothes, all of it was built on a foundation of sand, and I was holding the ocean. I literally owned the roof over their heads. If they defaulted on the operational debt, which they were currently doing because Melina had no idea how to run the logistics network, I could legally seize the family estate and evict them by the end of the week. Melina sat frozen in her chair, staring at the crying mother she had always idolized, and the broken, lying father she had always manipulated. Garrett stood up abruptly, his legs hitting his chair and sending it crashing backward onto the polished concrete floor. His face was a mask of pure purple rage. He looked like a man who was about to have a stroke. He realized the colossal trap he had confidently walked into. He had rushed to marry Melina to secure the Caldwell assets, only to find out there were no assets to steal. The trucks were mine. The warehouses were mine. The corporate debt was mine. The family home was mine. Garrett Thorne realized he had legally bound himself to a bankrupt shell, and I was holding all the keys. The study felt entirely devoid of oxygen. Melina's screams tore through the heavy silence, bouncing off the mahogany bookshelves and the framed photos of our grandfather. She stood panting, her chest rising and falling in erratic jerks. Her perfectly manicured hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white with the strain. She truly believed those signed transfer papers were her impenetrable shield. She thought the ink of our cowardly father could magically erase the forensic evidence sitting flat on the desk right in front of her. I looked at her. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. The sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from her pores was almost suffocating, but it washed over me like water over stone. Arthur Pendleton did not even pause his work. He simply turned back to the iron safe, his latex-gloved hands methodically pulling out more ledgers, utterly indifferent to a spoiled heiress throwing a temper tantrum. Thurgood stood beside me, a silent, immovable mountain of legal authority, watching the Caldwell family implode with clinical detachment. "You signed the estate transfer papers yesterday," I repeated, my voice dropping an octave, slipping into a terrifyingly conversational tone. "Yes?" Melina snapped, a desperate, triumphant smirk breaking through her tears. She took a step forward, suddenly emboldened by her own delusion. "Daddy signed everything over to me. Full control of the voting shares, full control of the downtown commercial trust. The merger with Thorne Capital is locked. You are too late, Aaliyah. You can bring in all the federal auditors you want, but you cannot touch my property. I own Caldwell Logistics." My mother, Coretta, let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief from the hallway. She reached out and gripped Garrett's arm, treating him like the anchor that would keep them all from drowning. Garrett, however, did not look relieved. The sweat on his forehead had gathered into thick droplets. His eyes darted nervously between the forged power of attorney on the desk and my perfectly calm face. He knew how the game was played, and he knew a checkmate when he saw one. I slowly unzipped the front pocket of my leather portfolio. I did not rush. I let the agonizing sound of the zipper echo in the dead air. I reached inside and pulled out my sleek black tablet. The screen woke up with a soft glow illuminating the sharp angles of my face in the dim morning light. I tapped the screen once, twice. Then I held it casually by my side, not even bothering to show it to them yet. "Do you remember last month, Lina?" I asked, taking one slow, deliberate step toward her. "Do you remember the night of the Founders Gala? You were wearing that ridiculous emerald silk gown you spent 3 months tracking down just to impress Garrett's mother?" Melina's smirk faltered. Her eyes flicked down to the tablet in my hand, then back up to my face. "What does that have to do with anything?" I walked into the dining room right before the first course was served. I continued my voice steady, weaving the memory into the room like a physical trap. "I did not stay for dinner. I just walked right up to your seat, dropped a thick sealed manila envelope on your plate, and walked out." My father groaned from the doorway, burying his face in his hands. He remembered. The entire house remembered. "You opened it," I said, taking another step closer. "And you screamed so loudly the catering staff dropped a tray of champagne glasses. You screamed, 'You are joking,' in front of 30 of Atlanta's most influential socialites. Do you remember what was in that envelope, Lina?" Melina swallowed hard. The remaining color in her cheeks completely vanished. "It was a draft," she whispered, her voice shaking so badly the words barely formed. "It was a fake draft of an injunction. You were just trying to scare me. You were trying to ruin my engagement party." "It was not a fake draft." I corrected my tone, sharpening into a blade. "It was a preliminary filing for a federal receivership audit. It was the exact document Thurgood handed you 20 minutes ago. But that was not the only thing in the envelope, was it?" I raised the tablet, the screen displaying a high-resolution, digitally stamped legal document. I swiped to the second page, highlighting a massive block of dense, heavily redacted financial text. Garrett pushed past my mother, his eyes wide with a sudden feral terror, as he tried to get a look at the screen. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "What are you looking at?" I ignored him entirely, keeping my eyes locked on my sister. "I gave you that envelope to warn you," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "I handed you the exact financial layout of Thorn Capital's massive offshore debt. I handed you the proof that Garrett was bankrupt. I handed you the evidence that he was using you to steal grandfather Elijah's land to save his own miserable life. I gave you the truth, Melina. I gave you the key to save yourself, and what did you do?" Melina backed away, shaking her head. "No, no, no. Daddy said the lawyers vetted him. Daddy said it was a perfect match. You threw it in the fireplace." I stated the finality of my words, striking her like physical blows. "You burned the evidence because you wanted a country club wedding more than you wanted to protect your own blood. You wanted to be a thorn so badly that you rushed the estate transfer. You bullied a weak, terrified father into signing over the legacy yesterday because you thought I was going to stop the merger today." I let out a short, hollow laugh that held absolutely no humor. It was a cold, metallic sound that made Garrett physically recoil. "You think you outsmarted me, Lina. You think transferring the estate yesterday saved you. All you did was legally bind yourself to a massive multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud investigation. By transferring the estate under a forged power of attorney, you did not secure the company. You just made yourself the primary target for the FBI. You handed Garrett the land, and in exchange, he is going to let you take the fall for his empty hedge fund." Garrett opened his mouth to scream a denial, but no sound came out. He was completely trapped, suffocating under the weight of his own exposure. My mother began to openly weep, sinking against the hallway wall as the illusion of her perfect aristocratic family shattered into a million irreparable pieces. My father remained silent, a broken, useless shadow of a man. Melina fell into the leather chair, her entire body shaking as she gasped for air. Her eyes were wide, staring at the tablet in my hand, as if it were a loaded gun pointed directly at her chest. "You only read the first page of that envelope, Lina," I said coldly, turning the tablet off and sliding it smoothly back into my portfolio. "I highly suggest you bring your fiancé and his lawyers to Thurgood's office at noon. Let's read page 2 together." I turned my gaze away from my sister's trembling frame and looked directly at the senior partner of Evans and Associates. Play the audio, Thurgood. Thurgood Evans did not hesitate. He tapped a command on the digital console embedded in the center of the black marble table. Instantly, the boardroom's state-of-the-art surround sound system hummed to life. The audio was pristine. It captured the unmistakable background noise of clinking crystal and muffled string music. It was the distinct ambiance of the Founders' Gala from a month ago. Then Garrett Thorne's voice filled the room, echoing from the speakers with crystal-clear, damning precision. "He is a desperate, gullible fool, Lina. Your father is so terrified of losing his country club status that he is practically handing me the keys to the kingdom." My father's head snapped up. The blood completely drained from his face as he heard the voice of the man he had trusted, the man he had chosen over his own flesh and blood, mocking his entire existence. Then came Melina's voice, sharp and eager, dripping with a sickening blend of greed and vanity. "I do not care about his status, Garrett. I only care about the transfer. Once Daddy signs the estate over to my name, how fast can we liquidate the land trust?" "Fast!" Garrett's recorded voice replied, a wicked, triumphant edge to his tone. "The second the ink dries on that transfer deed, I will execute a complete asset strip. We pull every cent of equity out of Grandfather Elijah's commercial district. I will wire the funds directly to the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands before the week is over." "And your pending lawsuits?" Melina asked on the recording, her tone entirely devoid of concern for her family's legacy. "The fraud charges up north. They will vanish," Garrett promised. "The Cayman accounts are untouchable by the federal courts here. The lawsuits will hit a brick wall. My family avoids prison, and we walk away with $30 million in clean, untraceable cash. All you have to do is keep your father convinced that I am saving his miserable logistics company, and we win. As long as my European wedding goes exactly as planned, and my name is on the deed, you can drain every single account." Melina laughed on the audio, a bright, chilling sound. "Let Aaliyah and my parents deal with the fallout. They always find a way to survive." Thurgood tapped the console again, plunging the boardroom back into a heavy, suffocating silence. I had left my phone recording on the mahogany credenza in the dining room, the night of the teaser, slipping it behind a silver candlestick right before I walked in and dropped the manila envelope on Melina's plate. They had been so arrogant, so blinded by their own superiority, that they discussed a federal crime in an open room. Bozeman Caldwell looked like he had been physically struck by a freight train. The hyper-masculine pride he had cultivated his entire life shattered completely, turning to fine dust right in front of my eyes. He had sacrificed my mental health, dismissed my professional expertise, and treated me like a disappointing burden solely to elevate Melina. He had worshipped his golden child. He had bowed down to a white aristocratic fiancé, desperate for proximity to their perceived power. And in return, they had played him for an absolute fool. They had laughed at him while plotting to steal his father's legacy and leave him to rot in federal prison. Bozeman opened his mouth, staring at Melina, but no sound came out. A single jagged tear slipped down his weathered cheek. Garrett Thorne lost his mind. The carefully constructed mask of the wealthy, untouchable East Coast elite completely dissolved into feral panic. He let out a raw, guttural scream and lunged across the wide marble table. His expensive suit jacket strained against his shoulders as he reached blindly for the digital console, desperate to smash the system, to destroy the recording, to somehow rewind time and unmake the last 5 minutes of his life. He never even made it past the center of the table. Thurgood's private security detail had been standing silently against the paneled walls. 2 massive men in dark suits moved with terrifying, practiced speed. They intercepted Garrett mid-lunge, grabbing him by the shoulders and slamming him violently back down into his leather chair. The impact knocked the wind out of him in a sharp gasp. One guard kept a heavy, immovable hand pinned firmly against Garrett's chest, keeping him pinned to the seat. I did not flinch. I did not move a single inch. I sat at the head of the table, my hands perfectly still on the polished marble, watching him struggle against the security guards like a trapped animal. I told you the night of the gala that I was giving you a warning, I said, bringing the room's attention directly back to the manila envelope that had started this entire collapse. I warned you, Garrett. I warned my sister. But neither of you respected me enough to look at the details. I leaned back in my chair, my posture radiating absolute, unchallenged authority. Page 1 of that envelope was the official title transfer of the Caldwell Fleet and warehouses to my LLC. I stated, speaking slowly so every single syllable could carve itself into their minds. It was the proof that I owned the ground you were standing on, but page 2 was infinitely more important. Melina was shaking so violently her teeth were chattering. She looked back and forth between Garrett and me, realizing that the trap had jaws much sharper than financial ruin. Page 2 was a copy of the formal criminal referral I filed with the district attorney's white-collar crime division. I continued, my eyes locked on Garrett's pale, sweating face. I handed over a complete forensic accounting of your offshore fraud, Garrett. I provided the routing numbers to your Cayman Island accounts. I gave the federal investigators a perfectly packaged, indisputable roadmap to every single crime you have committed over the last 4 years. The recording we just played was simply the final nail in your coffin submitted to the FBI 48 hours ago. Garrett's eyes rolled back slightly, all the fight draining out of his body. He stopped struggling against the security guard. He knew exactly what a federal criminal referral meant. He knew the survival rate of a white-collar investigation backed by hard audio evidence and offshore routing numbers was absolute zero. Vance Sterling, Garrett's lead corporate attorney, stood up. He did not look at his client. He did not ask for a moment to confer. He simply reached down, snapped the heavy brass locks of his aluminum briefcase shut, and looked at his associate. The second lawyer immediately mirrored the action, gathering his files with frantic speed. Mr. Thorne Vance Sterling said, his voice completely devoid of the aggressive arrogance he had brought into the room. Thorne Capital retained us to facilitate a corporate merger. We do not practice criminal defense, nor do we represent clients actively engaged in federal wire fraud and conspiracy. Effective immediately, our firm is formally withdrawing as your legal counsel. Garrett whipped his head around, his eyes wide with betrayal. Vance, you cannot do this. We have a retainer. You have to fight this. You lied to us. Garrett Vance replied, his tone as cold and unforgiving as ice. You brought us into a room to facilitate a merger using stolen, non-existent assets to cover up a felony. You are going to federal prison, and I will not let my firm burn down next to you. Do not contact our offices again. Without another word, Vance Sterling and his associate turned on their heels and marched out of the boardroom. The heavy frosted glass doors swung shut behind them, sealing Garrett inside his own self-made tomb. He was completely abandoned, stripped of his lawyers, his fake wealth, and his future. The reality of the situation finally slammed into Melina. The luxurious European wedding, the high society magazine spreads the elite country club validation. All of it was gone. She was not marrying a billionaire. She was tied to a federally indicted con artist, and she had willingly participated in a recorded conspiracy to rob her own family. Melina let out a piercing, hysterical scream of pure horror. It was a guttural, devastating sound of a woman watching her entire fake reality burn to ash. She dropped the forged transfer deed onto the floor and buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Coretta fell to her knees beside Melina, wrapping her arms around her golden child, weeping into the carpet as the Caldwell family dynasty officially collapsed under the weight of its own toxic lies. I sat at the head of the table, perfectly calm, watching the smoke clear. Thurgood Evans cleared his throat, a low, grounding rumble that snapped the remaining occupants of the room back to the harsh, present reality. He slid a fresh single-page document across the black marble. It was not a lease agreement or a criminal referral. It was a standard boilerplate corporate resignation form, drafted with lethal precision. I turned my attention to Bozeman. He was staring at his hands, watching his fingers tremble uncontrollably against his tailored trousers. He looked like a king who had just been informed his entire empire was built on a sinkhole and the ground was already giving way. "Sign it, Dad," I said. My voice held no malice, no triumph, and absolutely no pity. It was the voice of a forensic accountant balancing a final unforgiving ledger. Bozeman looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a desperate clinging panic. "Aaliyah, please. I built this company. I kept your grandfather's name alive. You cannot just strip me of my title. It is all I have left." "You mortgaged his name to buy country club memberships and European vacations for a daughter who just conspired to rob you blind," I corrected smoothly, my posture rigid and unyielding. "Garrett Thorne is going to face a federal judge, and when he does, he will drag everyone down with him to lessen his own sentence. He will claim you were complicit in the asset strip. He will point to the forged power of attorney you signed yesterday as absolute proof that you authorized the liquidation of the Caldwell Trust." Bozeman swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat as the immense, crushing realization of his legal exposure finally hit him. "If you fight me," I continued, letting the cold reality of his situation wash over him, "I will hand the board the operational debt. I will legally evict you from the estate by Friday. And I will step aside and let the FBI seize your personal accounts during their fraud investigation. But if you sign that paper right now, relinquishing all executive authority, all voting shares, and all claims to Caldwell Logistics, I will legally sever your name from Garrett's offshore conspiracy. You get to keep your freedom, but you lose the crown." It was not a negotiation. It was an execution. Bozeman reached for the heavy silver pen resting beside the document. His hand shook so violently, he dropped it twice, the metal clattering loudly against the marble. When he finally gripped the barrel, he did not look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the paper, his jaw tight with shame, and he signed his name. With 4 simple strokes of a pen, he transferred absolute, undisputed control of Caldwell Logistics directly to me. The following weeks were a masterclass in corporate sanitation. I officially took the CEO chair, and my first act was a brutal, necessary purge. I fired the bloated, overpaid executive board Bozeman had assembled over the years, a group of yes-men who had allowed the company to bleed out. I replaced them with a team of hungry, brilliant tech analysts and supply chain engineers. We stripped the company down to its raw studs and rebuilt it from the ground up. I implemented artificial intelligence-driven logistics tracking, automated dispatch protocols, and modernized the entire warehousing grid. I took grandfather Elijah's original vision of a reliable, hard-working freight company and dragged it kicking and screaming into the 21st century. I rebranded the fleet, replacing the tired, fading logos with a sharp, modern aesthetic that signaled a new era. Within 3 months, our operational efficiency skyrocketed, and our profit margins surged by 40%. Garrett Thorne did not survive the week. Federal agents arrested him at a private airfield just outside the city limits, catching him as he tried to board a chartered jet to the Bahamas. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were immediately frozen by international authorities. The Department of Justice slapped him with a staggering 60-page indictment for wire fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. The man who had walked into my boardroom smelling of expensive cologne and unearned arrogance was paraded across the evening news in handcuffs, looking small, pathetic, and entirely ruined. Melina's fate was arguably worse than a sterile prison cell. She was not federally indicted, saved only by her sheer documented ignorance of the actual financial mechanics of Garrett's scheme, but her reality was completely obliterated. Garrett's creditors came after her for the lavish wedding deposits. The IRS audited her personal accounts, freezing her assets. Stripped of the Caldwell safety net, Melina had to hire a team of desperate bottom-tier defense attorneys just to keep herself out of a courtroom. She had to flee Atlanta in absolute disgrace, unable to show her face at the galas and boutiques she used to rule. The last I heard, the former golden child of the Buckhead elite was working a minimum-wage desk job at a regional insurance firm in Dayton, Ohio. She spends 9 hours a day under flickering fluorescent lights, inputting data into a spreadsheet, handing over every single paycheck just to afford her mounting legal bills. Her fake European reality had burned to ash, leaving her with a life of tedious, inescapable mediocrity. The business was fully secured and thriving, but the familial rot required one final surgical excision. I summoned Bozeman and Coretta to Thurgood's office one last time. They sat across from me in the heavy leather chairs, looking entirely hollowed out. Their designer clothes suddenly looked cheap and oversized on their deflated frames. "You are going to continue living in the Buckhead estate," I told them, watching a brief, pathetic flicker of hope ignite in my mother's eyes before I extinguished it entirely. "I am paying the property taxes. I am paying the maintenance fees. You will not be evicted." Coretta let out a shaky, trembling breath, pressing a hand to her chest. "Aaliyah, thank you. We knew you would not abandon family. We knew you would do the right thing." "I am not doing it out of familial duty, Mom," I said, my voice as hard and impenetrable as diamond. "I am doing it because I refuse to let Grandfather Elijah's legacy property fall into a public foreclosure auction because of your complete financial incompetence. But there is a strict condition, a legal covenant attached to the deed." Thurgood stepped forward and handed them a thick, bound document. "You will have a roof over your heads and a basic monthly stipend strictly allocated for groceries and utilities," I explained, leaning back and watching their faces pale. "But you will never contact me again. You will not call my office. You will not show up at my home. You will not speak to the press about me or my business. You are ghosts. If you violate this boundary, even once the stipend vanishes, the house is sold to the highest bidder and you are entirely on your own." They stared at the paperwork in stunned, suffocating silence. They had no leverage. They had no money. They had no choice. They picked up the pens and signed their own banishment. For generations, society has demanded that Black women carry the immense, suffocating weight of their family's trauma. We are culturally conditioned to be the mules of the world, expected to absorb abuse, disrespect, and financial ruin, only to turn around and offer endless forgiveness and a warm plate of food. We are constantly praised for our resilience, but resilience is often just a polite, sanitized word for enduring unnecessary, relentless pain. We are taught that loyalty means suffering in silence, so others can thrive comfortably in their dysfunction. I actively chose to break that generational curse. I refused to perform the role of the dutiful, abused daughter any longer. I realized that my loyalty to myself had to be stronger than my loyalty to people who only valued me for what they could extract from me. I chose my own peace. I chose my own success. I chose to lay down the heavy toxic burden they had strapped to my back since childhood and walk away without a single ounce of guilt. The ocean breeze was crisp and tasted heavily of salt. I stood on the sprawling, pristine balcony of my newly acquired coastal estate in Monterey, California. The Pacific Ocean stretched out infinitely in front of me, a breathtaking canvas of deep sapphire blue and crashing white foam. The morning sun was just beginning to burn off the coastal fog, casting a warm golden glow over the stone terrace. Zoe, my newly appointed chief of staff, stepped onto the balcony. She was sharp, fiercely loyal, and carried herself with a quiet, unmatched efficiency. She held a steaming ceramic mug of dark roast coffee and handed it to me with a respectful nod. "The European shipping contracts just cleared escrow, Aaliyah," Zoe said softly, her eyes scanning the tablet in her other hand. "And the logistics expansion into the Midwest is officially funded ahead of schedule. The board is thrilled." "Thank you, Zoe," I replied, taking a slow, savoring sip of the coffee. It was perfect. My phone, resting on the glass patio table next to me, suddenly vibrated loudly against the surface. The screen lit up, cutting through the serene morning atmosphere. The caller ID flashed a name I had not seen in exactly 1 year: Coretta Caldwell. I stared at the glowing screen, knowing exactly what the call represented. The strict monthly stipend was likely not covering her coveted country club dues, or perhaps Bozeman had run up an embarrassing tab at a local tailor trying to keep up appearances. She was calling to beg for a loan. She was calling to test the unyielding boundary I had set, hoping that the passage of time had softened my resolve and made me susceptible to her emotional manipulation once again. I did not yell. I did not feel a familiar tightening spike of anxiety in my chest. I did not shed a single tear for the mother who had never known how to love me properly. I slowly picked up the phone. I looked at the name flashing on the screen one last time. I smiled, a genuine, completely unbothered expression of pure, absolute liberation. I tapped the red button to decline the call. Then, with smooth, practiced precision, I opened the contact settings and permanently blocked the number. I set the phone back down on the glass table. I turned my face toward the rising sun, closed my eyes, and took a deep, uninterrupted breath of the fresh ocean air. I was finally breathing free. True worth is never defined by the people who consistently undervalue you, even if they share your bloodline. The ultimate revenge is not about destroying those who hurt you, but about building an undeniable, successful life on your own terms. Financial and emotional independence are your greatest shields. Stepping away from toxic expectations allows you to discover your true potential and find the peace you actually deserve. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family expectations to build your own amazing success? Share your journey in the comments below, and please hit subscribe for more empowering dramatic stories.